Hi, my name's Yasser Seirawan. We're currently in our offices in Philadelphia, here on 7th and Snyder. In the back, we have my files and desk. And on the table in front of me, we have the various manuscripts that contain the entire Video Chess Mentor series. The VCM was quite a chore in putting together, let me tell you. It's over 2.5 years in the making. What I discovered in all my research was something very unusual. There wasn't any universal teaching system method. Well, the question became how to present the information. Let me show you what we did. We shot many scenes, including this one at the U.S. Blitz Championship in Somerset, New Jersey, as well as the prestigious World Open here in Philadelphia. I gave 2 simultaneous exhibitions, playing 40 people at one time, one at the University of Pennsylvania and one at the Port History Museum. At these exhibitions, the mayor and city of Philadelphia presented me with proclamations. I also interviewed 6-time U.S. champion Walter Brown and former U.S. champion and syndicated columnist Larry Evans. Many people have asked me for whom the series is aimed, for beginner, chess master, chess grandmaster. And to their question, I respond, to all of you. We have POIs, or points of information, for all levels of players, ranging from beginners to international grandmasters. This series is meant to be a challenging one, to challenge you to rise. The way to view this tape is to view it all the way on your first viewing. Don't stop the tape. Listen to me. Pay attention. Don't dwell on any thought or question you might have. Play the tape through. Watch the tape. Have faith in me as an international grandmaster, and don't worry, all your questions will be answered. This tape is broken into 2 study segments. The first study segment will teach you the board and its properties, the pieces and their values, and the 4 elements. Also, a classical opening. Before we go to the studios, let me take you to the demos and learn a bit about the board and its properties. We have broken down the board into 8 ranks, 8 files. This is the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H files. 8 ranks, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. Therefore, each square has a corresponding letter and number, A1, B1, C1, and so on. These are the long diagonals, and the 2 critical files are the E and D files, the center files. The center is this key area right here. This is the sweet center, these 4 squares. Over here, we have the queen side. White's queen side, black's queen side. And over here, we have the king side. White's king side, black's king side. Let's go back and learn how to set up the chessboard. Keep in mind that we have white space and black space. We now have the starting position. White has his space, these 32 squares here, and black has his space, these 32 squares there. 2 things that I'd like to point out. In print, as well as in video, white is on the bottom, black on the top. And you always set up the board with the right hand, lower right-hand corner square, white. We'll now go to the studio and learn about the 3 types of positions, the pieces, and their values. Now for the three types of positions. When all 16 pawns are on the board, we say the position is closed. You take 1 pair of pawns off the board, and the position becomes half open. If you take 2 pawns or more from the board, then the position is open. So we start the position closed, and usually most games end up being open. Our first piece will be the queens. The queens, being the most powerful pieces, are worth 9. They work best in an open position, and in the openings are best left at home until the position becomes open. Our second major pieces are the rooks. Rooks are worth 5. They're very clumsy in the opening in the early middle game, and they work also best in open positions, and especially in the endings when they really come, and it's in the endings when they become the most powerful. Also, they're very good defenders. Our first type of minor pieces are the bishops. The bishops also work best in open positions, and in the openings, they're like the rooks. They're very, very clumsy. Oftentimes, an open diagonal suddenly becomes closed, and you have no idea what went wrong, but suddenly the bishops no longer are as good as you thought they were. Beginners have a great deal of trouble with both the bishops and the rooks. It's best to keep in mind that they operate best in open positions. Our next minor pieces are the knights. The knights, like the bishops, are also worth 3. Unlike most of the other pieces, however, the knights work best in half-open and closed positions. The kings, the most important piece, we give a value of 3.5 to. That is to say, masters give a value of 3.5 to the kings. The kings are the most important piece. If you lose the king, or if you get checkmated, the game is over. But for purposes of force count and attacks, it's important to assign the king a value, and masters give it 3.5. The value system, or how the value system came about, is an interesting story in itself. The pawns are the least mobile and least valuable piece, or chess man, and we assign it a value of 1. The queen being the most mobile piece, that is to say, she can go all over the board very quickly within 1 or 2 moves, we give her, or assign her, a value of 9. The rooks also being a piece that can go to all 64 squares, but not as quickly as the queen, we give a value of 5. The bishops can go quickly to the squares about the chessboard, but they are limited to 32 squares as opposed to 64. That's why they only have a value of 3. The knight, although it can go to all 64 squares, can't get there as quickly as, say, a bishop or other long-range piece, and we give it a value of 3 only because it can go to all 64 squares. The king can also go to all 64 squares, but it also goes slowly. But for the purposes of the value system that I have, we give it 3.5. The value system leads us to the 4 elements, which in my interview with Larry, he briefly enumerated. Larry?
There are 4 elements in chess, as you know, Yasser: time, space, force, and pawn structure. And of the 4, force in itself is the most important. All other things being equal, if you're a pawn ahead, you're going to win the game. And Bobby Fischer feels the same way. I mean, if he'll snatch any pawn as long as he feels that he's not going to be demolished by it. He's willing to suffer for a long time.
Thanks, Larry. Each element influences our decisions in different ways. Chess is a very materialistic game. The most important element is force, or material. And when I'm talking about force, I'm talking about the overall force count. Learn to pair off pieces. For example, in this particular position, 3 versus 3, 3, 3, White's a knight ahead. He's plus 3 in the force count. He's ahead plus 3 in the value system. On this demo board, 4, 3, 2, 2, rooks pair off, bishops pair off, knights pair off. You determine that White is ahead 1 in the force count. Whenever you're ahead in the force count, you're winning. Force determines who's winning, all the way from levels of grandmasters to amateurs. Force also teaches something else, and that's how to attack. For example, over here, divide the board in half, and on the king side, White has a preponderance in force, so he should look to attack there. On the queen side, Black has a preponderance of force, so he should look to attack there. From calculating the force on each side of the board, you're going to get a very accurate reading as to whether or not an attack's going to work or fail. Our second and third elements, space and time, we'll be discussing in the studio. Our fourth element, pawn structure, we'll look at in study segment 2 and 3. Now let's go to the studio to study space and time. What I mean by space is that here, White controls 32 squares, or this is White's half of the board, this is Black's half of the board. When White plays a move like e4, he controls 5 of black's spaces. d5 and f5, h5 with the queen, and the bishop on f1 controls a6 and b5. So white has +5 at the moment in the space count. The person who controls more space than the opponent will have the more valuable pieces. The person who has the more valuable pieces will become the attacker, or the person who has space will become the attacker. So space determines the roles of each player. Space determines who's the attacker, who's the defender. Time, our third element, is determined by how many pawns and pieces are moved from their original squares. The person who develops more quickly, or who mobilizes his forces more quickly, will control more space. Thus, the person who develops more quickly will in turn become the attacker. There are 7 basic principles in chess. These are classical principles that generations of chess masters have handed down. They're very important for you to be aware of, so learn to use them and utilize them in your games as you're making your decisions. The basic principles are: always play for control of the center, and of course with specific emphasis on the sweet center. Open with an e-pawn or d-pawn. Don't develop your queen too early. If you do, she'll become the object of attacks. But most beginners love to develop the queen early, and it's a big mistake, and it's a fundamental error. Leave your queen at home. That's where she belongs, in the opening. Next principle: develop your knights before your bishops. The bishops have a difficult time in the opening because they're rather clumsy, whereas the knights, the moment they're developed, they become very effective immediately. Don't move the same piece twice. Once you developed your knights, develop other pieces in your camp. Having developed your knights, develop your bishops, here, and prepare to shelter your king by castling. The purpose of castling: you develop 2 pieces at one time in the time count, and you quickly bring your king to a nice safe haven and shelter your king. Finally, don't attack without justification. You have to ask yourself before you attack, what is the advantage that I have in the position that justifies an attack? And you have to have an advantage in one of the 4 elements. We'll now go to a classical opening, exemplifying all we've learned to this point. It's getting a little hot here underneath his lights, and it's about time to get serious. Dave, would you please take my jacket? Dave's my assistant here on the boards. First, we'll now go through a classical opening from White's perspective. White opens e4, e5, regaining what we call in chess the equilibrium. That's to say, White has the advantage because he can tip the scales in his favor to begin, and Black responds by creating an equal position. Knight f3, attacking e5, knight c6 defending e5. White plays bishop c4, developing his bishop on the classical diagonal. It would have been a mistake for White to play the move d3. This would lock in the bishop on f1, making it a less of an effective piece. So White first plays bishop c4. This move signals what we call the Italian opening. Black responds, bishop c5, in like developing his bishop. In the same manner, a mistake for Black would be the move d6, which would also lock in his bishop. Black develops his bishop on the classical diagonal, c5. White plays c3. The role in the opening of the c-pawn is basically to attack or support an advance in the center. Most of the time, you'll be playing strictly with the e and d pawns in the opening. After c3, plays knight f6, attacking e4. In this situation, the position is still closed. White now has a choice. He can play d3, in which case we get into what we call the Italian closed, or we can play our main line, which is d4. This is the Italian open. After d4, the position now becomes half open. Black exchanges pawn for pawn. When playing the move d4, white establishes what we call the center pawn duo. It's an extremely powerful structure. On the life set, what we have is pawns for white on e4 and d4. They occupy the sweet center as well as control black's squares e5 and d5. The center pawn duo is a very, very powerful structure. It basically occupies and controls the entire sweet center. In a game that I had with Michael Rode in the U.S. Blitz Championship in New Jersey this year, I had an opportunity to establish the pawn center. I played the move e4. This controls the entire white center as well as black from f5 to square b5. In addition, it restrains my opponent's idea, which was for him to play the move f5. After I established the center pawn duo, Michael went into a 50-second thinking spell. This gave the cameraman a chance to catch a few railbirds rubbernecking the action. The chess clock that you see here is used to time the player's moves. In blitz chess, each player has just 5 minutes for the entire game, so 50 seconds is a lot of time. The center pawn duo has made it difficult for Mike to find an active plan. At last, he moves. Once I've castled, the opening is almost over. We'll come back to this game later. Enough of that. Let's get back to the main line. After d4, black is presented with a very typical problem in the opening, what to do with the bishop. He's now attacked and he's forced to move it again, which violates one of the basic principles. Hey, but when you're forced to move, you're forced to move. Black plays bishop b4, check to the white king. White has two possible responses. The best move is bishop d2, which will be our main line. But another response that's possible for white is the move knight c3. The problem with knight c3 is it places the knight into an absolute pin. The pin is the first of our 14 types of tactics. All 14 tactics will be covered in study segments 1 through 4. There are 3 types of pins. The first is an absolute pin. The bishop pins the knight to the king absolutely. The knight can't move because that would be illegal, as the king would be in capture. This is known as an absolute pin. You can never leave your king in capture. Our second type of pin is called a relative pin. Here, the bishop pins the knight to the queen. The knight can move, but only at the loss of the queen. It's a relative pin. Our third type of pin is called the cross pin. There'll be one down the road. Look for it. A cross pin is when a piece is pinned in 2 separate directions. Here, the bishop on b4 pins the knight to the king, as well as the rook pins the knight to the queen. Now then, let's go back to the studios for the classical opening. After the move bishop d2, black is given an option: trading bishops or capturing the pawn. Bishop captures d2 check will be our main line. But what if he captures the pawn? Well, we'll take that right over here. After knight captures e4, this allows white an opportunity to regain his sacrifice pawn with an advantage. He'll employ what we call a double attack. Bishop takes b4. Knight takes b4. This gives you a unique opportunity to play. Bishop takes f7 check. King takes f7. And now the double attack. Queen b3, checking the king on f7, as well as the knight on as well as attacking the knight on b4. White regains his piece with advantage because black's king is now opened. Back again to the main line. After bishop captures d2 check, white will guard his e-pawn with a move knight on b captures d2, defending our center pawn duo, I should say. After knight takes d2, black now employs a double attack of his own. He plays d5, attacking c4, a bishop on c4, and our pawn on e4. Now remember what I told you. Basic principle. Don't move pieces unnecessarily. In this situation, instead of moving his bishop, the best thing that we should do is play e captures d5. After ed, knight captures d5, we have a full stop for a moment. I told you, don't bring out your queen early and don't attack without justification. But in this particular moment, white does have justification to begin an attack. And what he does is he sets up a battery, another type of tactic. Queen b3. The purpose of this idea of attack is to pin the knight on d5. Why is white justified in creating this attack? He's justified because he's ahead in the time count, one of our 4 elements. That is to say, before you play the move queen b3, count the pieces. How many pieces has white developed? How many pieces has black developed? If you have a +2 or more in the time count, you're justified in beginning an attack. And what do I mean by attack? Well, I shouldn't say, but in a future study segment, I'll get more to it. But an attack doesn't have to be a bridge-burning assault against the enemy king. It can be fight for center file, a center square, or just for development. Queen b3, creating a battery on the a2, g8 diagonal, attacking the knight on d5. Knight on d5 can't move because of the pin. Black reinforces his knight with the move knight on c to e7. White now castles, but full stop again. Critical decision. One of the most important decisions you can make in the opening is where to place your king, because it has long-term ramifications. White can castle queenside or kingside. White chooses kingside castling, one of our basic principles, castling early. The reason that he castles to the kingside as opposed to the queenside is because the pawn shelter is better on the kingside. But that's study segment 2. After castles, the opening is soon over. Now it's time to evaluate the position. We'll evaluate the position from the elements, from the point of view of the elements. The force count is even. In the time count, white is ahead 7-4, or a +3. What do I mean? White has developed king on g1, rook, knight, pawn, knight, bishop, queen for 7. Black has developed 4. King, rook, and both knights, 4. 7-4, white has a +3 in the time count. In addition, white controls more space, which gives him an advantage in time and space. So why is black in a bad position? What has black done wrong? Well, in actuality, black has done nothing wrong. Black has his own compensations, and those compensations are in the form of the pawn structure. But that's skipping ahead. You'll have to go to study segment 2 to understand what I mean by the pawn structure. Another very interesting opening middle game that I'd like to evaluate is a game that I had with Alexander Chernin, the champion of the Soviet Union, also in the Blitz tournament in New Jersey. In this position, what I was playing the black pieces, Chernin was playing the white pieces, is we have a half-open position to start out with. In addition, black has an extra center pawn as compared to white's e4 pawn, and black is already on what we call the half-open file. White isn't on his half-open file. This is a typical Sicilian-type structure, and black has a distinct marked advantage. After Chernin exchanged a pair of knights, I was able to create a battery on the half-open C file. While the cameraman watched some of the other top games, I began to push my pawns forward. Chernin brought a rook from the king side to help defend his queen side, to which I was applying strong pressure. I continued to gain space by advancing my pawns. This game was a tense one for two reasons. As an American, I view any encounter with a Soviet player as a key matchup, and since Chernin and I were the favorites in this Blitz tournament, this game could easily have decided first place. After d5, the position is about to be forced open, and it's still anybody's game, as we'll discover. That concludes Study Segment 1. I'd now like to share with you some of our efforts to promote Blitz. Here in the U.S., professional world of chess is played in two main fashions, tournament and 5-minute. Let me show you the contrast. You've seen a little Blitz chess. This is the more grueling form of tournament chess. Here at the World Open, over $200,000 in prizes was awarded to players of different classes, ranging from novices to grandmasters like myself. More than 1,500 players competed for these prizes. Tournament chess is much more sedate than Blitz. People think over their moves for minutes and sometimes even tens of minutes, whereas in Blitz chess, your moves have to come within seconds. Otherwise, you're going to be in danger of losing on time. In the World Open, the average length of the games is between 4 and 5 hours. Blitz is a whole different story. In Blitz chess, each player has only 5 minutes for the entire game. Thus, a game cannot last longer than 10 minutes. This fast pace gives players who think quickly and move quickly a big edge. Blitz chess appeals to all levels and ages of players. Another interesting aspect of the chess clock is that the stronger player can be handicapped to make the game more competitive. During a break at our studio shoot, the producer's children, Jesse and Tina, played a Blitz game, watched by their youngest sister, Kara.
And that we kiss together.
Tina, the weaker player, had 5 minutes to Jesse's 1 minute.
And this time, castle.
One fell in there. Shut up. Put yourself free.
The game's over, my flag dropped.
Hey, Tina won!
Hey, you! I flag drop and Daddy goes, hey, you!
You lost on time? Oh, look at this. Congratulations.
As you see, Tina used her advantage on the clock to score a rare victory over her older brother. Because of its quick resolution, Blitz is one of the most popular forms of competitive chess. We're now ready to begin Study Segment 2. Keep in mind that you have a pause and rewind button. Use it after your first viewing. Watch the tape all the way through on the first time. Have faith in me as an international grandmaster to answer your questions. Sooner or later, I'll get to them all. So far, I've given you the basics. Now I'd like to give you what I consider the white meat of the tape, which is how to make a plan using the pawn structure. Let's go to the studio. Early in my career, my biggest difficulty was finding a plan for a particular position. Indeed, the ability to find a plan separates all levels of players. How to find a plan? What to base your plan upon? Should you base it upon where the king is, where a knight is, where a rook is? What to do? Many factors are temporary. What we need to do is find a factor that will be good or valid for all or most of all positions. And that factor is pawn structure. Pawn structures determine the nature of the position. They tell us what are the open files, open diagonals, whether the king is sheltered and protected. They give us many, many clues. For example, here is what we have. It's called a pawn skeleton. In this pawn skeleton, white is attacking on the queen side. That is to say, he should look to attack on the queen side. He shouldn't look to attack on the king side. The open file is the e file, where you would place your rook. Knights would be very nicely placed on e5 or b4 or a5. Black squared bishop you would put on f4. Also, rook would go on b1. You wouldn't want your king on the queen side because that's where you're attacking. So you would want your king on the king side. Little things like this is how you'll determine your best plan for a given position. There are 3 categories of pawn structures: weak pawn structures, balanced pawn structures, and dynamic pawn structures. Our first look will be at weak pawn structures. They're important for two reasons. You must know what to avoid, and you must know what kind of pawn structures to give your opponent. Our first weak pawn structure is pawn islands. In this situation, white has 3 pawn islands. Pawns on b3 and a4 are 1, pawn on d4, 2. These kingside pawns are 3. Black has 2 pawn islands. This chain of pawn is 1 pawn island, pawn on a5 is another. Although the h4 pawn is not protected by pawn, say, on g3, it can be, and is not considered a pawn island of itself. Pawn islands are weak because they need protection of the pieces. If you tie up your pieces too much, then they can't do what you would like them to do. First example of weak pawn structures is a continuation of my game with Chernin, and I showed you earlier in study segment 1, and it's now here in the middle game. In this situation, count white's pawn islands. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. White has 5 pawn islands. Black has 2. Black began with the move rook a8. We'll see how it happened. I am now attacking 2 of white's pawns, the pawn on a5 and the pawn on e4. Knight f3 attacking my rook. Rook c5 reacting to the threat. e5, pushing his Isolani to attack my knight. Knight g4, once again attacking the Isolani. I'm down 1 in the force count, but I've compromised Chernin's pawn structure by giving him an Isolani, split queenside pawns, and a doubled a-pawns, which you'll learn about. Now, Chernin looks into the tactics stemming from knight takes g5, and instead decides upon c4, dissolving his split pawns. After trading on c4, I grab the a-pawn, creating a battery. Again, I have a doubled attack against white's pawns. Knight captures e5. At last, I'm ahead in the force count by 1. Even so, this is a blitz game, and he is the Soviet champion, so the game is far from over. Later in this tape, we'll see how it finished. Now let's take a closer look at the Isolani. Our next weak pawn structure is the isolated pawn. Like pawn islands, it doesn't refer to any specific structure, but rather a pawn, and an independent pawn, because that's what an isolated pawn is. In this situation, white has an isolated pawn on d3. If he was to capture a piece on c3 and play the move, say, b captures c3, the pawn on a2 would become isolated. These pawns would no longer be isolated. Pawn on d3 is isolated, or whenever a center pawn, a d or e pawn, is isolated, we refer to it as an Isolani. The most typical types of Isolani position is when the Isolani is on d4. The Isolani is weak because it needs protection. It can't be protected by a pawn. But another serious weakness or defect of the Isolani is the square right in front of the Isolani. The reason for that is that if black were to establish a piece there, for example, a knight or a bishop, he would blockade the pawn, and white wouldn't be able to get rid of the blockader. Another typical Isolani type feature is when the pawn's on d5 and there's a fianchetto in the position. Just from this pawn skeleton, you can get a very good idea of where the player's plan should lie. White has 2 open files, the C and the E files. That's where his rooks belong. He also has more space in the center, so he should be anticipating playing towards the center. From black's point of view, black will have fianchettoed his bishop on g7. His open files are the C and D files. That's where he'll place his rooks. And the knights will probably be placed on f6 and b6 to attack the d-pawn. In a game example I had with a fellow grandmaster, I had the white pieces, and Anatoly, he had the isolated pawn, or the Isolani. My rooks are in a battery. They're doubled on the D line, and his queen is in a pin. Anatoly played queen e8 to get out of the pin. White had been threatening to play e3 and capture the pawn. I now chose to play the move knight d5. This is a very typical type thing that a lot of players get confused about. It's very simple. For knights to be effective, they must be centralized. Again, I'm referring to the specific central area. I wasn't worried by the double attack knight b4. The reason for that is because when you're playing an Isolani type situation, what you need to do is trade minor pieces. Okay? The isolated pawn becomes weaker and weaker the more minor pieces you get off. You want to play a major piece endgame. Knight b4 would have played right into my hands. After knight b4, with the double attack against the queen, queen b3, an exchange of knights on d5, bishop captures d5, exchange of bishops on d5, and it's quite evident that this pawn, which is now attacked by 3 of white's pieces, will soon be lost. As a result, this endgame is certainly lost. So, again, in isolated pawn positions, you want to play major piece endgames. After knight d5, my opponent didn't play knight b4, he prepared. He played queen e6. The purpose of this move was to prepare the double attack knight b4. So I got out of this discovery, queen a4, and after queen a4, I bring more pressure on black's queen side, and in addition, again, attack the weak pawn. After queen a4, rook d8, attacking the knight, knight f4, attacking the queen, queen e5. It becomes obvious that black's major problem in the position is his weak pawn. If he could trade that pawn, he'd have no problems. And all white needs to do is really simply win that pawn, and the game is lost. Well, in order to win this pawn, I have to get rid of the defender. This is known as a tactic of removal of the guard. I play rook c2. This seals the fate of the pawn, because as soon as that defender is forced to move, doink, game's over. He's going to lose the pawn. After rook c2, I'm bearing down for a 3rd time on the attacked knight. Black was forced to trade queens with the move queen a5. After queen a5, queen captures a5, knight captures a5, rook takes c8. If my opponent recaptures with the rook, then I trade bishops and I win the pawn right away. So he recaptured with the bishop. And after bishop captures c8, I played knight d5. Once again, interfering with the defense of the d4 pawn. My opponent was in a jam. He couldn't defend the pawn with knight c6 because this would leave him vulnerable to a fork. After rook c1, if the knight moves, then I play knight e7 check, forking the king and bishop. And if he plays bishop defending the knight, then I play rook captures c6, bishop captures c6, knight e7 check. A double attack is any piece other than the knight, because the knight, when it forks, it can fork 2 pieces or 3 pieces or 4 pieces. A royal fork is when a knight forks a king and queen. A family fork is when a knight forks a king, queen, or rook. After knight e7 check, white wins in force and will win the game. So, in this position, after knight d5, my first interference move, then came bishop e6, rook captures d4. I've won the pawn, and the game is now lost for black. But there's a nice tactic that I'd like to share here, and it went like this. king f8 in order to get out of the knight check, discovering an attack on the rook. After king f8, f4, this move prepares to develop the king, because in the endgame, your king becomes more powerful and you should look to use him. In the middle game and so on, he's very vulnerable, but as the endgame approaches, look to use the king. Knight c6, attacking the rook, rook d3. My opponent decided that if he waited too long, I was just going to win, being ahead in force, so he forced the situation. He played knight e7, attacking my knight. I played knight c7, attacking his rook. He exchanged rooks. Now I produced another type of tactic, and this is called a Zwischenzug. Keep in mind that chess is an international game with an international character. Zwischenzug is a German word whose English equivalent is an in-between move. White makes an in-between move. Instead of recapturing the rook at once, I captured the bishop with check, forcing fe. And then after recapturing the rook, I was ahead a pawn in an endgame of minor pieces. In a minor piece endgame, the bishop is generally considered superior to the knight when there are pawns on both sides, on both flanks. So in addition to the advantage of having the bishop over the knight, I also have an extra pawn, and I won rather easily. Our next weak pawn structure are double pawns. Double pawns are the result of captures. In this skeleton, black has double pawns on c6 and c7. Double pawns are less mobile, and they eventually become targets. They're especially vulnerable to knights. A key element when you have or when you possess the double pawns is to learn to push the most forward. This is a situation that I had with Michael Rode in New Jersey. I was playing white, and I played c5. Let's see what happened in the visuals. c5 dissolves my double pawns. After his capture, I now play bishop b5, placing Mike's knight in an absolute pinch. He castles long because his kingside pawns are attacking and would not adequately shelter his king. But queenside castling has its drawbacks. You'll understand why when we continue this game on tape 2, study segment 4. After queen captures a4, I've equalized the force count, dissolved my double pawns, and begun a queenside attack. Let's return to the studio and see another example of double pawns. In this situation, white has double pawns on c4 and c3. If that was his only problem, he wouldn't stand too badly off, but he also has done terrible things with his minor pieces. His bishop on a3 is on a bad diagonal. It's on a blocked diagonal. Bishops need open diagonals to be effective. In addition, his knight on h4 is decentralized. It's out of the game. Black began the move knight c6, attacking the pawn on d4. White defends with rook d1. After rook d1, black forked the queen on b3 and the pawn on c4. The only move white could make was queen b5. In this position, black made the decision to exchange queens and take advantage of his endgame possibilities. He did it as follows. Queen takes b5, cb, knight c4, attacking the bishop on a3. Bishop came back to c1. After bishop c1, black needed to open up the positions for his rooks. He did that by playing a6. After a6, b takes a6, rook takes a6. White had split queenside pawns, the a2 and the c4 pawn, c3 pawn. After rook takes a6, d takes c5, b takes c5. Not only does he have split pawns, but he has a 3-to-1 pawn islands advantage in favor of black. White hastened to bring his knight back, knight g2. After knight g2, black played knight d5, attacking the isolated pawn on c3. White defended with rook d3. Black created a battery on the A line, doubled his rooks, and the pawn on a2 is lost. White is now completely lost, as a matter of fact. His pieces are totally tied up. His structure is in shambles. Black is about to win a pawn. White made a further error by the move e4. After e4, instead of moving his knight right away, black made a Zwischenzug. He first attacked White's rook. White's rook found itself in a terrible predicament. If it moves to d2, then it's forked by the move knight f3 check, winning an exchange. So he was forced to move to d1. After rook d1 came knight captures c3, again forking the rook and the pawn. The rook can't move to e1 because of the move knight f3 check. It was forced to move to f1, and after rook f1, black won the second pawn with rook takes a2, and white gave up as he saw that he was 2 pawns down and he's probably going to lose a third. Here you saw an example how difficult it was for white to have any play once he had double pawn, and how easy it was for black to exploit those double pawns. There's another type of double pawns that are even weaker than normal double pawns, and that's isolated double pawns. I consider isolated double pawns so bad as to reduce their value by half. In this skeleton, white has 2 sets of isolated double pawns. The pawns on a2 and a3 are doubled and isolated. The pawns on c2 and c4 are doubled and isolated. And although we would say that in the force count, in the strict force count, white has 2, 4, 6 pawns, black has 2, 4, 5 pawns, white is a point ahead in the force count. But because of the way I look at isolated double pawns, I reduce 2 for white. 1 here, each pawn is reduced by half, and 1 here, each pawn is reduced by half. So actually, I say that black is ahead in the force count, 5 to 4. Our next weak pawn structure is the backward pawn. In this skeleton of the backward pawn formation, the pawn on d6 is backward because its advance is prevented by the pawn on e4. When you're playing against it, what you should try to do is restrain it, then blockade it, and finally destroy it. That was Nimzovich's theory for how to play against backward pawns. The backward pawn structure gives the player with the backward pawn a very cramped game, and particularly bad will be his bishop on e7 or the bishop that protects the backward pawn. With that bad bishop, what the player should try to do is exchange it if he has the bad bishop, or avoid exchanging it if you're playing against the backward pawn formation. The main line that we'll be looking at is this position. In this position, both players have fianchettoed their king's bishop. Black has the backward pawn, and what he'll be looking to do is to advance his pawn and try to exchange it off. The moment he's able to do that, he'll be fine. He'll have no problems in the position. What white has to do is restrain that pawn from advancing. White does this very nicely. He plays a very, very subtle move, rook c1. The pawn structure, the skeleton, the pawn structure predicts that this would have been the better move, rook d1, bringing a rook to the open file, or what we call the half-open file. Instead, he plays rook c1 with the purpose to play c4, because when he plays the move c4, then the backward pawn cannot be advanced. Black now played f5. f5, white played c4, restraining the pawn. Black took on e4, and now white played the move knight c3, again, further restraining the pawn. Black saw that it was soon going to be impossible to play the move d5, so he gave up that idea and brought his knight to f5. If black had tried to capture the c4 pawn with, say, the bishop, bishop takes c4, then he walks into a pin on the C line. And after bishop takes c4, would come knight takes e4, pinning the queen and the bishop. Followed by the move b3, white would advantageously win back the bishop on c4. On the other hand, if black plays the move queen takes c4, if black plays queen takes c4, then after knight takes e4, white would have a discovered attack against the queen on c4, as well as a double attack against the pawn on d6. White would regain his pawn with advantage. So, back to the main variation. After knight c3, knight f5, knight takes e4. Black now traded his knight for the bishop. Knight takes e3, queen takes e3. And he saw that he had to prevent the move knight g5, attacking the bishop on e6. So he did this by the move h6. After h6, what white's strategy is now is, again, keeping that pawn on d6 from moving. So he played b3, buttressing c4. After b3 came rook d8, rook d1, rook c8, rook c1, b6. Now, after restraining the pawn from playing to d5, white prepares to blockade it. Plays knight c3. The purpose of this move is that the bishop on g2 defends d5 as well as the knight on c3. After knight c3, queen e7, white played bishop d5. This allows me to explain one of the advantages of fianchettoing the bishop. Fianchettoing the bishop is a hyper-modern strategy which was basically seen at the turn of this century. The idea behind a fianchetto bishop is it remains on the long diagonal, pressures the sweet center. The fianchettoed bishop also defends the king. In addition, it can sometimes play itself back to f1 on a more open diagonal, the classical diagonal, or it can sometimes go to h3, what I like to call the accelerated fianchetto. In this case, white is able to exchange off bishops on d5, and after bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, the backward pawn is completely blockaded, and after the further moves rook d1 and knight e4, white has a strategically won game. As I've mentioned before, most important of the three types of pawn structures, balanced, weak, and dynamic, are weak pawn structures, because weak pawn structures are your basics. They are your foundations. By using and understanding these pawn structures, you can win in your tournament games. Now then, let me set you up for the second part of study segment 2, balanced pawn structures. Balanced pawn structures are precisely that. They're balanced, quiet games. There are three types of balanced pawn structures. Quiet positions, like 3 and 3 versus 3 and 3, locked positions, and solid pawn structures. In 3 and 3 versus 3 and 3 positions, the games are very quiet. The pawns rarely do any of the work. The rooks are generally exchanged on the open files, knights are exchanged in the center squares, and bishops on the diagonals. So the pawns rarely do the work. When there are structural weaknesses, for example, a double pawn, then that becomes the major strategical theme of the position. Another very common balanced pawn structure is a 4 and 2 versus the 4 and 2. Let's go to the studio and learn about that more. In this situation, 4 and 4, 2 and 2, the open files are the C and D files. This is where you'll place your rooks. In the case of bishops, it's more difficult. The bishops for white, the black square bishop might be on the G3 diagonal or the G5 diagonal. For black, the long diagonal. The knights will probably be placed on C6 for black, C3 for white, so that you can control the open files. Let's take a look at this in a game example. In this situation, white prepares to occupy the square c6. This is going to be a tremendous outpost for the white knight. Knights, for some strange reason, do very well when you're white on c6 and f6, or when you're black on c3 and f3. White begins, queen b3. This move prepares the way for the rooks to the center files. Also, white's plan will be to control the square c6. After queen b3, rook c8, rook c1, queen b7, check to white's king. White plays the move queen f3, interposing on the check. Trading pieces is gainful when the defender is losing control of the squares that you're trying to attack. After queen f3, white welcomes an exchange of queens in order to strengthen his control of square c6. Black plays knight d5. Even though the position is somewhat quiet, many dangerous things can occur in quiet positions. After this move, black begins to threaten a double check and a checkmate. The threat, black's threat in this position, is to play the move knight e5, attacking white's queen, queen e4, f5, forcing white's queen off the long diagonal. And after queen captures e5, white is exposed to a double check, followed by checkmate. Knight f4 check, on king f1, queen h1 mate, and on king g1, queen g2 mate. So, with this threat in mind, white prepares to answer the threat. After knight d5, white plays e4, driving away the knight from its centralized square. The knight retreats to f6, and now white plays b5. This move is entirely in accordance with white's plan, which is to control the square c6. Black now has a problem: how to combat this square. He decides that he's going to weaken the support of the c6 square by playing a6. After a6, white plays knight c6. Now, the result of white's plan is strikingly obvious. The knight controls an enormous number of squares, 2, 4, 6, of black's territory. In addition, he opens up the long diagonal for his bishop. After knight c6, black is threatened with a fork on e7 and forced to retreat, bishop f8. a4, maintaining control of b5, which supports a knight on c6. A takes b5, A takes b5. This explains why neither player moved their rook off the A file, because both players had anticipated this position, and both players wanted to keep a rook on the open file. After rook takes A1, rook takes A1, black played the move rook A8. I'll skip ahead for a moment, and I'll tell you why white plays the move he now plays. He has a space advantage, and he refuses to trade pieces. Rook d1, bringing the rook to an open file. Even though there are knights on the files, it's still open, because it's the pawns that determine whether the files are open or closed. After rook d1, black is more or less in an extremely difficult situation. He can't move the knight on d7 because the bishop will capture the knight on f6. Ineffective would be rook a2, because after the move rook a2, white could simply play the move knight c4, defending the bishop on b2, and preparing to come in on the 8th rank with rook d8. So, black kept his rook on a8, and he played the move knight e8. This prepares to develop the knight to c5. After knight e8, knight c4, knight c5, white created another outpost for his knight. He played the move e5. This prepares to come into d6, and now black's really in a great deal of trouble. His best move is probably to sit passively by playing the move h6. Instead, he chose to make a mistake with the move rook c8. This move takes the rook off the open file. There's no reason that black should give up the open file. White played rook a1. This prepares to penetrate to a7, which would trap black's queen. Unable to play rook a8, black played rook c7, and after rook a7, realized his queen is still trapped. On queen c8, knight captures b6, black loses his queen and loses the game. In this type of pawn structure where it's locked, play is going to be dictated by what we call pawn storms. In such a situation, white is going to open the game on the king side with g3 and f4, attacking e5, or a3, b4, attacking c5. Pawn storms on the king side, pawn storms on the queen side. Black is going to do likewise with a6 and b5 on the queen side, g6 and f5 on the king side. The most fundamental key about locked structures is what we call the base pawn. The base pawn for black in this situation is d6. The base pawn is sort of like the keystone. It supports the entire pawn chain. If white was to play the move f3, then the base pawn would become g2. If white was to play the move b3, then the base pawn becomes a2. The base pawn as such constitutes where we should focus our attack. In this skeleton here, we have what we call the closed French. In the closed French, for black, the base pawn is f7. For white, the base pawn is b2. White's play will be geared towards attacking the base with f4, g4, f5. It's very typical that white should play fe6, f captures e6, and suddenly the new base becomes e6. From black's point of view, he'll be playing b5, a5, b4, and attacking the base, the new base, c3. Again, in locked structures, the most fundamental thing to understand is to attack the base. The base forms the focus of the entire strategy, the plan. This is a typical situation arising from a king's Indian defense. From black's point of view, his chain is from c7 to f4. It becomes your job, when you're playing white, to attack this base. From white's point of view, our base is the pawn g2. g2 supports the entire chain. We lose g2, we lose the game. Vice versa. Black loses c7, he loses the game. White begins the attack with the move b6. After b6, a captures b6, a captures b6. Black must now abandon this pawn chain. He cannot play the move cb, because then after cd, all the pawns fall. So instead, he captures on c5. White captures on c7. Black captures on c7. White now plays the interference move d6. Black's queen on c7 was protecting the pawn on e5. d6 cuts that protection. After d6, queen c6. The new base is now e5. White changes, or his plan, I should say, evolves. With the new base being e5, he changes his attack, and he attacks the new base. After bishop b2, he opens up the a file. Black exchanges rooks on the a file and plays b5 in order to capture d6. After b5, knight captures e5, queen captures d6, bishop captures b5. White has succeeded in his entire aims, which was to destroy this pawn chain. This pawn chain that was before so nice and comfortable, giving black a good game, is now completely gone. As a result, black's entire game is in shambles, and the attack that he had anticipated on the king side is about to rebound against him. A very fundamental principle. An attack on the flank is best met with a counterattack in the center. Another key to understanding locked pawn structures is when the pawns on the flanks, whether they be king side or queen side, are locked, it's important to understand that that flank becomes an ideal haven for a king. For example, in this skeleton, the pawns on this king side are locked. White's king would say belong on h2, and in that way he could turn his attention to the queen side in the center, knowing that his king is safe. In a game I had in 1979 in Holland, I was playing the black pieces. In this situation, White has been attacking me very strongly on the king side. He's managed to open up the H file. From the pawn structure, I determined what were the key lines and files and diagonals of attack. The only open file in the position is the H file. So whoever controls that file is going to have an advantage. In addition, the best diagonal in this situation is this long diagonal. The queen side's completely locked. So I determined that that's where my king belonged. I played the move king d7. This is a very, very strange, uncommon move. Normally, the king is castled. In this situation, I moved the king one square at a time to a flank. When you move the king one square at a time to a flank, queen side or king side, it's called castling by hand. It's not to be recommended. But the reason I played it is because I recognized that the king on the queen side would be quite safe. And in a sense, that's what being a pro is all about, knowing when to make the wrong moves, but at the right time. After king d7, I'm preparing to take over the H file. My opponent played knight d2, and I challenged him on the H file. He now recognized that it would be a mistake to capture on h8, because then after queen captures h8, I would have a battery on the long diagonal, and I would control the open H file. So my opponent played rook g1. After rook g1, king c7, my opponent recognized that the long diagonal, being the diagonal to control, tried to trade pieces. He played rook b1, the idea to play b3 and bishop b2, and to challenge me on the open diagonal. Anticipating this plan, I played rook h3. And after b3, I played queen h8, which forms a rather unusual double battery. I control the open H file as well as the long diagonal. After queen h8, my opponent realized that he could no longer challenge the open diagonal, played knight f1. After knight f1, knight d7, bringing the reserves into play, bishop f4, in order to challenge the sweet center square e5, played knight e5. We exchange knights on e5, followed by an exchange of bishops on e5. After queen captures e5, after f3, defending e4, I now played the move bishop d7. Now let's take a full stop and just look at the position for a moment. Black has complete domination of all the key points. In space, he's well ahead. His rook on h3 is on the only open file in the position. In addition, he can bring in the other rook on the h file. And in short, black quickly won. The question is, what was the key to this? How did this all evolve from just a few moves? Well, the key was the maneuver king d7 to c7, castling by hand. Black recognized the pawn structure was telling him the plan, and he followed through. Chess is an unusual sport in that you will always find an opponent who you have a particular trouble with. whether he always beats you in open type positions or half open position or closed positions. For such a type of opponent, it's good to have a solid system. And I recommend two. The first is the Dutch Stonewall. It's noted as such for its extremely solid pawns in the center, d4, e3, f4. In the Dutch Stonewall, usually white is castled kingside. The knights come to this wonderful outpost on e5, knight e5, and it's often followed up by knight f3 for their supporting e5. White squared bishop usually goes on a d3 diagonal, and white can bring his queen to the kingside to h5, or use a rook lift, rook f3, rook h3. The drawback of the Stonewall is the black squared bishop. Normally what you try to do is to develop it before you set up the Stonewall to g5, or sometimes you make an accelerated fianchetto going out to a3. In a typical game-type position, we have what we call the Pillsbury attack. I appreciate that the Pillsbury attack doesn't exactly follow the skeleton, and indeed, some of my game examples don't follow the skeletons exactly, but they're very similar. In the Pillsbury attack, the pawn isn't on c3, the knight's on c3. What we have here is a wonderful outpost for the knight on e5, guarded by pawns on d4 and f4. Even though this is a solid defensive pawn structure for white, he can also use it for the attack, as I'll show. White plays the move queen h3, with a double attack against the square h7. White now threatens to capture on d7, followed by a capture on f6, and then the checkmate on h7. Black is forced to create a weakness, g6. If he plays the move h6, then we can sacrifice on h6 and perform a rook lift. After g6, white plays the move f5. White has a tremendous buildup of forces on the king side. Black's play is on the queen side. Therefore, he plays the move b4, trying to stop white on the king side by counterattacking on the queen side. White, however, pursues his attack. Plays f captures g6, sacrificing his knight. If black makes the mistake of capturing this Greek gift, then after b captures c3, white performs checkmate. Plays bishop captures f6, threatening queen captures h7 checkmate. If h captures g6, queen h8 checkmate. If f captures g6, then queen e6 check and mate in 1. So after bishop captures f6, black is forced to play knight captures f6. Now comes rook captures f6. Again, threatening mate in 1 with queen captures h7 check. So black is forced to respawn. F captures g6. After f captures g6, bishop captures g6. Again, white is threatening checkmate in 1. H g6 allows rook g6 checkmate, so black is forced to play rook takes f6. Now white has a mate in 2. You figure that one out. So black doesn't accept the offer of the sacrifice piece. Instead, he recaptures h captures g6. After h g6, white decided to set up a battery on the h4 d8 diagonal with queen h4. To queen h4, black had nothing else to do, no other recourse, but to play b captures c3. After b captures c3, knight captures d7. Black can't recapture with the knight because of the pin on the diagonal. It would cost him an exchange. So instead he played queen takes d7. In study segment 4, I'll give you more rules on how to continue these type of attacks. But it's one thing that's very important to recognize is don't trade attacking pieces for defensive ones. So white played rook takes f6 as opposed to exchanging bishops on f6. After rook takes f6, black couldn't accept the rook because he's going to get mated on h8. So instead, he prepares to defend the square g6 by playing the move a5. White is threatening in the position to play bishop takes g6, or to prepare to play bishop takes g6. After a5, always remember to bring your reserves into the attack if you can. After rook f1, creating a battery on the f file, rook a6 to defend across the 6th rank. White now played bishop captures g6, threatening checkmate in 1. After bishop takes g6, f takes g6, white played rook takes f8 check, bishop takes f8. Now he played rook takes f8 check. This move illustrates the wonderful attacking ability of the queen. The queen is a tremendously formidable attacker and a very poor defender. Here, white sacrifices a rook in order to bring his queen into the attack with queen h8. After king takes f8, black can get mated in several ways. After queen h8 check, king f7, queen h7 check, king e6 allows the Gordian mate queen takes g6, king e8 allows queen g8 checkmate. So instead, black is forced to play king f8, allowing his queen to be skewed. Our third part of study segment 2 is the dynamic pawn structures. In dynamic pawn structures, the pawns play a much greater role. Let's go to the studio and see what I mean. Our third type of pawn structures are dynamic pawn structures. What distinguishes them from the other two is that pawns play a greater role, indeed an almost decisive role. In dynamic pawn structures, the value of the pieces fluctuate. In some cases, a queen really isn't worth 9, she's worth less, or a rook isn't worth 5, he's worth less. Our first type of dynamic pawn structure is the passed pawn. A pawn is really at its best when it is passed. In this skeleton, white's pawn on c5 is passed. When it advances, no black pawn will be able to blockade it or capture it. As a result, the white pawn can go through to promotion. Most promotions take place in the endgame, when there are fewer pieces to hinder the pawn's advance. We'll be featuring two main examples of a passed pawn. Our first one, white has a passed pawn on e5, which is currently pinned. As Capablanca said, when the number of pieces on the board diminishes, the passed pawn increases in strength. We also have another quote, and that quote is, "Passed pawns must be pushed." And that's precisely what white does. He plays e6. Now, black has a choice. We'll see right over here, if black captures the bishop, then white plays e7, attacking the rook. After rook e8, all white needs to do is get rid of that rook, and that pawn's going to promote. And after rook c8, the rook's placed in an absolute pin, backed by the bishop on h3, the pawn's going to promote. So, black cannot play bishop captures d4. Back to our main line. Black played rook e8. White now played e7 with a threat to play rook c8 with an absolute pin, followed by the promotion of his pawn. Black closed the file with knight c5. After knight c5, white remembered a fundamental law of mobility for the rooks. Rooks belong on open files. So white played rook f2. White now threatens rook f8 check, rook takes f8, e takes f8 equals queen checkmate. Black cannot play rook captures e7 either, because then rook f8 checkmate, because the bishop's in an absolute pin. Black played king g8, preventing rook f8 check. White now captured the knight. After bishop captures c5, bc5, the bishop played bishop e6 check in order to drive the king back to h8, and after king h8, white penetrated on the open file, plays rook f7. That's a major principle of having your rook on an open file, is that in order to penetrate the enemy camp. White plays rook f7. Black gave up at this point because there was no way for him to stop the loss of the rook. White's next move is to play bishop d7, followed by promoting the pawn, and white will win the rook. We all know that once a pawn is advanced to the end of the board, it can promote. But I'd like to share with you a cute little tactic, our 11th tactic, called under promotion. In this situation, we have what is known as the Savadra study. White plays c7, threatening c8 queen. Black plays rook d6 check. Now white can't step up the board because then he would be placed in an absolute pin and black could give up his rook for the pawn. Therefore, in this situation, white has to step back. After king b5, rook d5 check, king b4, rook d4 check, king b3, rook d3 check, king c2, black now sets up a cute little trick. He plays rook d4. And now, in this situation, if white was to promote his pawn to a queen, then after c7, c8 equals queen, black plays rook c4 check. Queen captures c4. Whenever we have a situation like this, this is known as stalemate. Black cannot move his king because he would have to move it into capture. Therefore, the game is a draw. So what white does in this position is he under-promotes. Instead of promoting to a queen, he promotes to a rook. The purpose of this is to threaten rook a8, followed by quick checkmate. After c7, c8 equals rook, under promotion, black defends the threatened checkmate, and now comes king b3 with a double attack. Threatens rook c1 checkmate, and king captures a4. So, you see, under promotion is a very tricky tactic. Let's go back to the studio and study how to defend against passed pawns. Our next main line is what to do when playing against the passed pawn. Well, Aaron Nimzovich, summed it up very well. He said the passed pawn is a criminal. Surveillance measures won't do. He must be placed under lock and key. And what he meant by that was blockade. You must learn to blockade your opponent's passed pawns and then capture them. In this situation, Bobby Fischer, playing white against a former world champion, Tigran Petrosian, was faced what to do against the passed pawn. He has a tremendous outpost for his knight on c5, but Bobby understood that bishops are better than knights in open positions, and this is an open position. So therefore, he exchanged his knight for his opponent's bishop in order to get the better and minor piece. Knight captures d7 check. To knight d7, rook takes d7. Bobby brought his rook to the open file. White now threatens rook c6 with a double attack against the pawn on a6. Rook d6 preventing that threat. He now played rook c7. Threat to double on the 7th, rook e7. After rook c7, Petrosian prevented that by attacking white's rook and interfering with this rook's protection of e7. To knight d7, white dropped back, rook e2, and Petrosian played g6, trying to interfere with the effectiveness of the bishop on d3. As the game evolves from a middle game to an end game, the king can be activated because, again, the king is a powerful piece. He's worth more than a minor piece. So Bobby activates his king, king f2. Black, who's in a very passive position, if he moves his rook on the a file to e8 to challenge white's control of the e file, then after rook e8, an exchange of rooks, followed by rook a7, white is going to win this a6 pawn. So Petrosian played h5. when you have a bishop, fundamental is not to put your pawns on the same color as the bishop. Here, Bobby has two pawns, the f3 and g2, on white squares, and he has a white square bishop. He therefore puts them on dark squares. He plays the move f4. After f4, Petrosian really had no counterplay in the position, played h4. White now plays king f3, activating his king. He's now threatening king g4 and capturing the errant pawn on h4. Petrosian was forced to play f5. This is exactly what Bobby wanted. Bobby wants his opponent to put his pawns on like squares so that he can use his bishop to attack them. Bobby now played king e3 with the idea of restraining the passed pawn on d5. He plans to blockade it with king d4 and then to capture it. Petrosian couldn't allow that to happen and played d4 check. To d4, king d2, white has a threat. And the threat, as we see, is a nice little surrounding and capturing maneuver of the passed pawn. White threatens to play bishop c4, followed by king d3, and in order to exchange the defender, play rook e6. After the rooks are exchanged, this pawn will be blockaded and lost. Faced with this threat, Petrosian had to find a response. The response wasn't so good either. He had to play knight b6 in order to prevent bishop c4. But this allowed white to penetrate and to double rooks on the 7th. Up in the barbaric Northwest, where I come from, when we double rooks on the 7th, we say the rooks are on the refreshment stall. After rook e7, knight d5, we have what we call a quadruple fork here. Both rooks are attacked, both pawns are attacked. But white had foreseen that the black king is too vulnerable on the back rank. After rook f7 check, king e8, white moved his other rook out of capture. Black now played knight takes f4. White played bishop c4, knight d5. Coming back, and after bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, Bobby played rook h7 with unstoppable rook h8, checkmate with the major pieces. This exemplifies Nimzovich's theories of restraint, blockade, destroy. Now we'll go on to some more examples. Protected passed pawns are simply passed pawns in a more powerful version. In this skeleton, the pawn on c5 is the protected passed pawn. The reason they're more powerful is simply that they're more difficult to capture. Be very hesitant when pushing a protected passed pawn. The reason is, if it doesn't promote, you're undercutting its support. Now, let's return to my blitz game with Alexander Chernin, which we saw during our discussion of pawn islands. In this position, both players have passed pawn. White has a passed a pawn, and black has a passed f pawn. My f pawn is more dangerous because it has advanced farther than Chernin's a pawn. With the move f2 check, I use a removal of the guard tactic to win a bishop. Once I'm a piece ahead, I'll try to exchange rooks. The game is now won, but the question remains, can I make all the moves necessary to checkmate white before my flag falls? Note that at every stage of this game, play is determined by a passed pawn. Chernin has to allow me another passed pawn because his king is in stalemate. It has no legal moves. At the start of this scene, I had what are known as connected passed pawns. Let's return to the studio to learn about them. An even more powerful example of passed pawns are the connected passed pawns. In this situation, white has connected passed pawns on b4 and a4. They're extraordinarily powerful because they work with each other in pushing the blockader away. When you have just one passed pawn, it can be blockaded, such as in our Fischer example. But with two, they work with each other. The connected pass pawns can be extremely powerful. As I mentioned earlier about dynamic pawn structures, they can change the value of pieces. Connected pass pawns that are pushed 2 squares away from promotion are worth a rook. Connected pass pawns, when they're both 1 square away from promotion, can be worth more than a queen. For example, in our game example, we have Timon v. Nance. In this situation, White has a superior position. He could, for example, play E captures F5, B captures C3, B captures C3, and he would be a pawn up and have a better position. Instead, White embarks on a faulty combination. He plays the move E5. After E5, White had anticipated the black queen moving. After the black queen moves to, say, a square like B6, then after A captures B4, Black couldn't then respond queen captures B4 because E captures F6 would win a piece. White would therefore be a pawn up with an excellent position. A 1 position, in fact. Instead, however, White was in for a big surprise. After E5, Black sacrificed his queen for a knight. He played B captures C3. White being obligated E D6, E captures D6. And now Black has the much vaunted connected pass pawns. After the further move moves rook E1, C3, it was quite obvious that White, although he's up a queen for a knight, is dead lost. White played the move queen B4 in order to prevent the pass pawns from pushing any further. But then came knight D5, attacking the queen, queen B7, C2, sacrificing the knight. White realized that queen captures D5 would allow C1 equals queen, followed by B1 equals queen. So instead, White decided to get counterplay, he had to push his own pass pawn, and played D7. Black sidestepped with his rook, played rook C8, D8. White now played bishop D3. This is a case of too little too late. Black played C1 equals queen. And after C1 equals queen, queen captures D5, rook captures D7, attacking the queen, queen A8 check, bishop F8. White has a big problem. He's not going to stop that other pawn from queening, and after bishop takes F5, rook D1 wins easily. White's king is in an absolute pin. After a further move like G takes F5, B1 equals queen is unstoppable. And the question then becomes, if pass pawns, protected pass pawns, and connected pass pawns are so powerful, how do we get them? Well, we get them by playing with majorities. In this skeleton, each side has their own majority. Black has a 4-3 majority on the king side, White a 3-2 majority on the queen side. Pass pawns come about when players decide it's time to push their majorities. In Black's case, he'll push his majority to E3, create a pass pawn. White's case, he'll play C4, B4, C5, B5, and C6. Another important note to make about pawn majorities is the long pawn chain versus short pawn chain pawn majority. In my experience, it's better to have a long pawn chain than a balanced pawn chain. For example, I would much rather have a 5-1 pawn chain than a 3-3, or a 4-2. I would much rather have a pawn chain of a 4-2 versus a 3-3. I don't like balanced pawn chains so much as I like a long pawn chain. We'll now look at a game example featuring majorities. Here, the pawn structures predict a very dynamic struggle. White has a pawn majority on the king side, black on the queen side. In addition, white is threatening the knight fork, knight f6, attacking the rook on e8, and the pawn on h7. The pawn on h7 being isolated is quite a target. Another thing to also remember about dynamic pawn structures is it requires foresight, calculation, and visualization, because in dynamic pawn structures you're going to get very, very sharp positions. So you ought to be able to practice visualization, and you can do this by going over tactical books, and we'll be recommending some books for you to get. In this situation, black decided to sacrifice a bishop in order to get a host of passed pawns. He played c captures b3, white captured rook captures c8, rook c8. It would have been better to play bishop c8. White now played bishop takes a6, accepting black's offer. Rook c2 check, king f3, b3 captures a2. Black is now anticipating playing rook c1 in order to promote his passed pawn. White is forced to blockade with rook a1. In his combination of 4 series of moves, black had anticipated that he would have a winning game. He thought that after his move bishop b4, there was no way to stop bishop c3, followed by the promotion of his pawn, and he would win back his sacrifice material and have connected passed pawns on the queen side. However, white also has his play on the king side. He has his majority. And white had anticipated the same combination and played the move bishop d3. Black cannot now play bishop c3 because white captures the rook, plays bishop b3, and captures the passed pawn. This is a nice law of mobility, or a nice characteristic of the bishops. The bishops are the best piece to handle connected passed pawns. After bishop d3, rook d2, white captured the isolated pawn on h7. And after bishop h7, bishop c3, white captured the passed pawn on a2, and rook takes a2. Black must have been very happy at this point because he felt he had won back his sacrifice material, but then came the rude reality that after g4, g5, there's no way to stop white's passed pawn. And indeed, after the move d4, g6 check, king e7, g7, there was no way to prevent g8 equals queen, promoting the pawn to a queen, and white wins easily. Now that we've learned about connected passed pawns and majorities, let's look at an earlier stage of my game with Chernin. You saw how I pushed my passed pawns on the king side and won the game. But how did I get these passed pawns? Since I have a 4-2 majority on the king side, I push my pawns there. Activating my bishop with a double attack against white's rook and g2 pawn. I now bring both rooks to open files and increase my control of space. Excellent! By trading a pair of kingside pawns, I convert my 4-2 majority into a 3-1. This brings us near the concluding phase of the game, which you watched earlier in the study segment. Pushing our majorities is the ideal. Sometimes, though, you must play with a minority. Here's what I mean. A minority attack comes about when the majorities are inflexible. It's not always that we can use the majorities, because if we try to push them, they may be captured. In such a case, we would use a minority attack. Minority attack was relatively unknown until the turn of the century. Here we have a skeleton of a minority attack. From White's point of view, his majority is on the king's side. But the moment he tries to advance them, he can weaken his structure. As a result, he advances where he stands with his minority. He plays the move b4, the idea a4, and b5. The purpose of the minority attack is to force a backward pawn on an open file, in this case the c file. From Black's point of view, he'll play his minority attack, f5, f4, and try to force a backward pawn on the e file. Let's take a look at our game example. In this example, the rook on b1 supports White's minority attack, and he plays the move b4 with the idea of playing b5. Another important purpose of the minority attack is not only to give the opponent a backward pawn on the open file, but also to use the most advanced outpost. One of the things about the minority attack is it violates the classical theory. The classical theory always says, attack where you have an advantage in force. The minority attack doesn't do that. It attacks where we have a disadvantage in force. However, there are some classical reasons why it's okay, acceptable, and that is you open up the position on the queen side where you have an half-open c file. After b4, ab, ab, Black decided to start a minority attack of his own. He played the move g5. This was a mistake. It would have been better for him to have done passive play with the move bishop d7, as White's minority attack is going to get there first. After g5, b5. Now Black has a problem. It would have been a mistake for White to play bishop takes f5, as we'll see over here. If White had played bishop takes f5, this would have undercut the support for the knight on a4, and it would have led to a tactic, the removal of the guard. Black would have captured on f5, and after the queen recaptures on f5, the knight on a4 would no longer be protected, and after rook takes a4, White would have lost a piece. So White refused the opportunity to capture the pawn, and instead came back and continued with his plan, which was the minority attack. After b5, Black was forced to compromise his pawn structure. Remember what I was teaching you about pawn islands. Now Black has 3 pawn islands, and these 2 pawns, the b7 and d5 pawns, are going to become isolated. White responded with bishop takes b5. The reason that Black had to compromise his pawn structure was because if he had chosen to defend it with bishop d7, then he would have been exposed to a fork. After b captures c6, bc, White plays knight b6, attacking bishop on d7, rook on a8. Rook is forced to move, say to b8. Then after knight takes d7, queen takes d7. The pawn on f5 can now be captured. White would win the pawn and the game. So again, this means that Black couldn't play bishop d7, and he should have played bishop d7 before he had played the move g5. As the situation stands, after bishop takes b5, the rook on e8 was forced to move again. For bishop d7, then after an exchange on d7 again, the knight b6 fork exists. After bishop b5, Black played rook e7. White now played bishop d3, threatening to play knight b6, which would fork the rook on b8 and the pawn, and preparing to capture bishop f5. Black prevented this with bishop c7. And now with these pawn islands, all White has to do is attack the pawns because now they're much weaker. White plays knight c3 with a threat to play knight takes d5 and an absolute pin on the queen and the king. Also, white threatens bishop f5. Black defends both threats with rook f7, and now rook b5. Black is given a choice of which pawn to lose, the b7 pawn or the d5 pawn. Just a quick word about pawns. Although we say pawns are worth 1, and all pawns are relatively equal unless they're doubled, I have a theory. My theory says that the center pawns, D and E pawns, and the C and F pawns, are stronger than any other pawns. So given a choice of which pawn to lose, you would rather lose a flank pawn as compared to a center pawn. Anyway, that's an advanced concept. We'll get into those things later. After rook b5, black defended with bishop e6. And white captured. Rook takes b7. After rook c8, black prepares a pin on the c file. White gets out of this pin with queen b3, also defending the rook on b7. After bishop a5, with an attack on the knight on c3, knight came back to e2, and after rook takes, b7, queen b7, rook b8, queen c6, attacking the bishop, rook b6, white dropped back. After queen c2, attacking f5, black plays g6, white plays g4, attacking f5 again, and after queen c8, white traded queens, and after bishop c8, you can find the move that caused black to resign. The diamond pawn structure is a result of two captures. It's usually played when employing the minority attack. It's distinguished, the skeleton is distinguished by double f-pawn. It's an extremely solid structure, allowing the king on g1 to be well protected and insulated. Normally, this allows you to attack on the queen side. The diamond pawn structure usually results from Queen's Gambit exchanges, Slavs. Also, there's some Sicilians and Caro-Khans where it comes from. The diamond pawn structure, being a derivative of the minority attack, the reason I didn't put in a game example is because we simply ran out of time. We have a lot of good news to tell you. On tape 2, there are more examples of weak, balanced, and dynamic pawn structures. So far, we've concentrated upon the fourth element, pawn structure, to teach you how to plan your attacks. On tape 2, study segment 4, we'll be looking at the other elements, force, space, and time, to plan and concoct attacks. Now, let's take a look at Jesse and Tina playing more blitz games. Both Jesse and Tina know their basic principles, but Tina knows them only by rote. Jesse tries to take advantage of her inexperience by setting up an early queen takes f7 checkmate. Tina feels flustered, under the pressure of the clock. Knowing that Jesse has only a minute, she plays quickly, trying to force him to lose on time. Jesse springs his trap. Overlooking her brother's devilish plan, Tina falls into disaster.
Checkmate.
Checkmate.
Thank you.
I always get a big kick out of watching beginners fall for scholar's mate, fool's mate. Let me show you a few of the elementary mates from the openings. The earliest that a player can lose is in 2 moves. Queen h4, checkmate. This is what is known as fool's mate. The most common type of checkmate that I've seen over and over and over again in many, many beginners' games is what is commonly called scholar's mate. To e4, e5, queen h5, which we know from the basic principles is a bad move, attacking the e5 pawn, knight c6, defending the pawn, bishop c4. White threatens an immediate mate with queen f7. Black blithely ignores the threat, knight f6, which allows queen takes f7, check, mate. Our third type of mate, again, features the f7 weakness and is called Legal's mate. After e4, e5, knight f3, attacking the pawn, d6, black plays the Philidors, bishop c4, developing. Bishop g4, not quite the best move. Knight c3, continuing developing. And now, if black makes a doodah move, this allows a very nice combination called Legal's mate. After knight captures e5, white moves his knight out of a relative pin, and after bishop takes d1, we have bishop takes f7, check, king e7, knight d5, checkmate. I hope you'll be able to use some of these elementary mates in your games, but keep in mind it's usually beginners that fall for them. This completes study segment 2. We'll now be going to study segment 3, which will be teaching you split pawns, screen backward pawns, which was similar to the backward pawn I showed you in tape 1. Now let's go to the studio for split pawns. Now for split pawns. Split pawns refer specifically to flank pawns, the A and C or the F and H. In the skeleton that we have before us, the split pawns for white are A2 and C4. Split pawns are basically flank pawns that have been isolated. Both pawns, the A2 and C4 pawns, are both isolated. Split pawns become weaker as the game progresses because they need piece protection, just like isolated pawns. It's not necessary to center your attention on split pawns in the middle game, but just to place your pieces effectively, because as I say, they'll get weaker and weaker as the game progresses. In this situation, black has split pawns on A7 and C5. White plays rook E1, bringing his rook to the open file and preparing the battery rook F E3. Black now played knight F6 with the discovery against the rook on F3. Knight G5 has an interesting sub-variation which we'll look at right over here. If knight G5 with the double attack against the rook on F3, white has an opportunity for a very rare tactic. This tactic is going to be called the windmill, or in some countries, the seesaw. After rook G3, black avoids a move like bishop G7 followed by H4 by moving the knight on G5, defending C5. After knight E6, you sacrifice an exchange. When you sacrifice an exchange, you sacrifice a rook, a major piece, for a minor piece, a bishop or knight. After your exchange sacrifice rook E6, and after Fe, you force the move rook G7 check, forces the move king H8. You force your opponent to walk into a discovered check. And after king H8, then comes rook captures E7, discovered check by the bishop. If now king G8, then comes rook G7 check. The king is forced once again to move into a discovery, and then white can wipe out the whole black army. The windmill or seesaw tactic is really one of the most devastating tactics in chess. Seesaw can wipe out the entire enemy army. Back to the main line. After knight F6, attacking the rook, white plays rook E3. He now has a double attack. He attacks the bishop on E7 as well as the pawn on C5. After rook E3, black plays knight D5. Knight D5, attacking white's rook and forcing white to respond before he captures the pawn on C5. White moves, rook G3. This again threatens the windmill tactic. Black responds to the windmill tactic by the move G6. After G6, white captures knight takes C5. White wins a pawn. If black plays queen A5, as in this sub-variation, two pieces of white, the knight on C5 and the rook on E1 are being attacked. White plays rook captures E7, Knight captures e7. Knight captures b7. White wins two pieces, two minor pieces for a rook, wins force, and he has a devastating position. So queen a5 can't be played. Back to our main line, after knight takes c5, instead of the move queen a5, black plays the move rook c8. White now avoids playing knight takes b7 because he realizes that after rook takes c2, he'll also lose this bishop. So, first, white plays the move b4, defending the knight. After b4, white's a pawn up, and black has to immediately reestablish equality in the force count, otherwise he'll be lost. So, if he plays knight takes b4, as in our sub-variation over here, if he plays knight takes b4, then we have queen c3, a devastating move because it threatens checkmate in 1 on the long diagonal. After queen c3, black would be forced to respond to this mate threat by a move like f6. This would allow queen captures b4, followed by the win of the bishop on b7. So, back to our main variation, the knight cannot capture the pawn on b4. Instead, black plays queen b6, getting out of this possible threat of knight b7 and putting pressure on c5 and b4. White now plays queen d2. The purpose of this move is to get out of the pin that exists on the c line, threaten to take the bishop, also to threaten to invade on the dark squares. After bishop takes c5, b takes c5, queen takes c5, black wins back his pawn but is skewered. Another tactic. A skewer is the opposite of a pin. A pin attacks the piece directly. A skewer attacks the piece behind the piece that is directly attacked. Here, white plays bishop a3, skewering black's rook on f8. The bishop can't be captured because it's defended by the rook on g3. So after the queen is forced to move, you skewer a rook and you win an exchange, and the game will be won. This position is a skeleton of the screened backward pawn. Here, the d6 pawn, being backward, is screened by white's pawn on d5. The play is much more subtle, and white will expand on the queen side with this kind of a pawn attack, and black on the king side with this type of pawn attack. The play is much more subtle, and the weakness of the backward pawn structure is in the fact that black has much less space. For example, in our screen backward pawn structure, black has been basically kicked back, and in this situation he has a problem. How to make his bad bishop a good bishop? Right now, white is threatening to expand on the queen side with c4. Black made a horrible, horrible strategical lemon here. He played the move f4. He allowed the bishop on e2 to come to g4, which literally cut his position in half. After f4, bishop b6, knight takes b6, rook takes b6. White is now prepared to advance his pawns to c4, b4, and c5. Black played bishop g5. To bishop g5, bishop g4. White now kills both of black's rooks. This is a very important point to understand. In this situation, black has one open file or half open file for his rooks, and that is his c file. When his rook is forced to move passively away from the c file, both rooks become bad. After bishop g4, rook is forced to move away. After rook b8, white now plays rook e1. The purpose of this move is to restrain black from playing e4 and e3. Remember Nimzowitsch: restrain, blockade, destroy. Black now came up with another lemon, which was the move queen c5. As I said earlier, What white will try to do is advance on the queen side. This move provokes white to do what he wants to do anyway. After queen c5, rook e4, black is now strategically lost. White will advance with tempi, with time, on the queen side. After rook e4, rook f8, b4, queen c7, white now played c4. Black, being virtually helpless at this point, played king h8, getting his king out from an exposed square. And after king h8, c5, white is able to force his pawns through. To c5, dc, d6, attacking the queen, queen, d8, b captures c5. Black tried to get in some counterplay. He played the move f3, attacking, making a discovery against white's queen. White can't take the bishop, it's being defended. White played queen d5, centralizing the queen. An incredibly powerful move, queen d5. It just literally cuts black's position in half, gains an enormous amount of space. It's in the endgames that the queen really needs to be centralized. Then she's at her most powerful. After queen d5, black played f takes g2, rook takes e5, attack against the bishop. Black played queen f6, threatening checkmate n1. White easily parried this threat by playing the move rook f5, and after rook f5, queen a1 check, king captures g2. After king captures g2, black brought his bishop back from g5. After bishop f6, white played d7, and after further moves, queen takes a5, rook takes b7. Black was soon lost because the pawns just advanced towards promotion. That ends our weak pawn structures, and I'll make a brief recap. The entire purpose of understanding weak pawn structures was to know what you should avoid, what structures for you to avoid, and what structures to try to give your opponent. Avoid isolating your pawns, splitting your pawns, doubling your pawns. Do whatever you can to do that to your opponent. Give him the targets so that you can win what I like to refer to as the children, the pawns. Many players have a particular nemesis, an opponent with whom they have a great deal of trouble. For such an opponent, it's good to have a solid setup. In tape 1, I recommended one, the Dutch stonewall. In this tape, tape 2, I'm recommending a second one, the pawn triangle. Let's go into the studio and see what I mean. Our next solid pawn structure is the pawn triangle. The pawn triangle gets its name because it's similar to the Dutch stonewall in that there's a triangle of pawns on d3, c4, and e4. We have one of the drawbacks of the pawn triangle, or one of the things that it's noted for, is the very awkward fianchetto. What I mean by that is the bishop is fianchettoed on g2, but its diagonal is blocked by the pawn on e4. As in the Dutch stonewall, a key outpost is the square d5. The king's knight usually comes to e2, and white usually castles kingside. The bishop on c1 can either go to e3 or g5. The nice thing about the pawn triangle is its flexibility. You can play for a queenside attack with rook b1 and b4, or you can play for the center with bishop e3 and d4. Or you could play for a kingside attack with f4, f5, g4, g5. So the nice thing about the pawn triangle is its flexibility, and you can tailor your strategy for a particular opponent. If you know that he hates to be attacked on the king side, you can play the pawn triangle and attack him on the king side. In my game example of the pawn triangle, I was white in my match against Vukic. I had tried to play on the queen side by playing the move a3 and b4, but my opponent blocked me by playing the move a5. So being blocked on the queen side, I switched to attacking in the center. I played the move bishop e3 with the purpose to play d4. That's one of the problems with playing the pawn triangle as well, is you create a hole. The hole, in this case, is d4. A hole is a good place for the opponent to occupy if he can do so with a knight. Just in the Dutch stone wall, we had the hole on e4. In the pawn triangle, we had the hole on d4. My opponent didn't want me to play the move d4, so he played knight d4. After knight d4, I couldn't let the knight just stay there, so I captured it. Bishop takes d4. C takes d4. Knight b5, with a double attack against the pawn on d4. Opponent defended it with queen b6. Now I recognized that he's planning on playing the move bishop d7 and capturing on b5. So I played the move a4 to ensure that any captures by my opponent results in a positive recapture, ab. After a4, played knight c7. Idea of this move was to bring his knight to the nice outpost c5. Again, for the knights to be effective, they must be centralized. And outposts such as c5, e5, d4 are all very good outposts. And in this position, c5 is the natural outpost for Black's knight. Having been stymied on the queen side and in the center, I turned my attention to the king side. Played the move f4. After f4, knight a6, and now played the move h3, preparing further expansion on the king side. After h3, my opponent played e5. His queen and bishop couldn't be tied up forever, defending d4, so plays e5. After e5, this gave me an opportunity to expand further on the king side with f5. After f5, after the move e5, my opponent's blocked the long diagonal. After e5, f5, he now has a better diagonal for his bishop, and he plays bishop h6. After bishop h6, I played h4, a similar idea to what my opponent's just done. He's found a better diagonal for his bishop. I'm planning to find a better diagonal for my bishop, because my long diagonal is closed. After h4, bishop d7, Black develops, king h2. The purpose of this move is to prepare bishop h3 to protect it, to get it off, to get my king off of the dark square g1. Knight c5. Now I played bishop h3. After bishop h3, I'm anticipating capturing on g6, opening up the f-file in order to trade light squared bishops, and then my knight on b5 will be an excellent piece because it bears down and attacks the backward pawn on d6. After bishop h3, my opponent made a mistake. He began to get worried about what was happening on the king side, and so played g5 in order to keep the king side closed. Remember what I was saying earlier. The king excels in a closed position. But you have to ask yourself, what does Yaz mean, excels in a closed position? How can a king excel? Well, a king is a very valuable piece. Remember, we gave it a force count of 3.5. It's got to be worth something. And what is it worth? It defends a flank. A king bolsters a flank, discouraging attacks. So in order to keep his king fine, in order to keep his king happy, my opponent tries to close the position with the move g5. However, he overlooks a clearance sacrifice. I play knight captures d4 in order to bring my queen to h5. After knight d4, e captures d4, queen h5. My opponent now has a problem. What to do with his bishop on h6? King g7 runs into f6 check, removing the defender. Bishop g7, f6, bishop h8 allows a quick checkmate, so that can't work. And there's no way to keep the position closed. So my opponent tried the move f6. And after queen captures h6, he traded pieces on b5, bishop captures b5, a captures b5, and again, he's trying to keep his king side closed, and I'm threatening hg5. So he played g4. This allowed a devastating rook lift. And after the move rook f4, g captures h, rook g4 check. My opponent's king was forced to take a walk. I'll let you work the rest out. Our 13th tactic is clearance. Clearance arises when one of our pieces is in the way of another piece, either on a square, a file, or a diagonal. In this situation, white would like to bring his queen to h1 so that he could threaten queen h7 checkmate. To do this, he has to clear the rook out of the way. But if white makes a passive move, then black can respond to the threat. A clearance is when you move the piece with gain of time, or you win a tempo. In this case, rook h8 check, king captures h8, queen h1 check, king g8, queen h7 checkmate. Over here, in my game with Vukic that we just saw, the problem was that my knight on e2 prevented my queen from going on the diagonal to the square h5. So I had to move my knight on e2. But to get it out of the way, I moved it with tempo. Knight captures d4, followed by queen h5, what we just saw. That completes balanced pawn structures. I'd like to now move on to buttress tape 1's work on dynamic pawn structures. Keep in mind that on tape 1, I showed you one kind of majority. Now we'll go look at little and big majorities. Another example of playing with majorities, which exemplifies other POI's, points of information, is a game with Larson. In this situation, both sides have what we call big majorities. A 4 versus 3 is a little majority. You're only up 1. You have 1 extra pawn to your opponent. In this situation, black has a big majority on the queen side, white a big majority on the king side. As we know, passed pawns and majorities should be pushed. Black begins at once with the move b5 in order to push his majority. White plays rook e1 in order to advance his with e6 and f5. Black stops this with rook e8. White plays the move queen f3 in order to prepare to push his pawns on the king side with g4 and so on. Black now played c5. White began to feel a lot of trouble in this situation, and he felt that by pushing his passed pawns, he wouldn't equal what black was doing on the queen side, and so he attempted to blockade the pawns with the move rook d3, which is completely erroneous. Instead, he should have continued to push his pawns because the rooks will not blockade black's pawns. Black played d4. And after rook d1, black decided that it was time to move this knight, which is on an excellent square, but in the way of his majority. Instead, he brought it to the outpost b3. And after knight a5, white realized the error of his ways. Black is preparing to play rook b3, knight b3, followed by c4. The knight on b3 protects the pawn on d4. White must now move his rooks again anyway. White now played g4, but this is again a case of too little too late. After g4, knight b3, black is completely prepared to play c4. White now played rook e1, c4, rook d1. Black has now pushed his pawns to c4 and d4, much further advanced than white has pushed his pawns, and begins to attack white's king. He does this by playing the move b4. The purpose of this move is to sacrifice 2 pawns for connected passers, which are going to be devastating, as well as making white's king weaker. After b4, a takes b, d3. After d3, black is threatening d2 with a double attack against the bishop on c1 and the rook on e1. White played bishop d2. After bishop d2, the king is no longer protected by the bishop. Black played a3. After a3, b takes a3. Black now played knight d4, attacking white's queen. Queen f2, and now the devastating move queen a4. And that wonderful pawn shield that white had had previously has now been forced up the board by captures. After queen a4, black threatens mate in 2 with queen c2 and knight b3 mate. So he was forced to play bishop c3 with the idea that the queen will guard will come across and guard the king. Black could now win with the move queen c2 check, but he found an even nicer way to win. He played knight e2, a very nice interference move, also combined with a Zwischenzug. If white captures on e2, then the rook on d1 is left with check, and after queen takes d1 check, and de2, black would win. Therefore, white was forced to move his bishop. And after bishop b2, queen c2 check, white played king a1, and after c3, the pawns rolled through, and black quickly won. Two things that I'd like to point out about this example. That is, first of all, the role that white's bishop played. White had a bad bishop. The reason he had a bad bishop was because it wasn't on an effective diagonal, combined with the fact that the pawn on f4 blocked the bishop on c1. The other point was that the knight played a wonderfully decisive role, and that's a characteristic about the knight. The knight supports majorities better than the bishop. An extremely dynamic attacking weapon is the hanging pawns. Here, in this skeleton, features the hanging pawns. The pawns on d4 and c4 are hanging. From white's point of view, they give him a tremendous edge in space. And if they can play d5, they generally unleash a bishop on b2, which is very powerful. The problem or the drawback of the hanging pawns is that in the endgame, they can become very weak, or as more pieces are traded, the weaker they become. If the player is forced to play c5, the hanging pawns can be blockaded and lost. From white's point of view, the hanging pawns are in d4 and c4. From black's point of view, hanging pawns are on d5 and c5. The pawns are hanging because the d pawn can have no protection, the e pawn is missing. The c pawn has no protection because the b pawn is missing. In our game example of hanging pawns, features a rather famous classical example. Black has the hanging pawns. He has more mobility. He has two long-range pieces that bear down on white's king. Black begins with a sacrifice d4, opening up the long diagonal for the white squared bishop. After d4, ed, black begins a rather typical double bishop sacrifice, beginning with bishop captures h2 check, king captures h2, queen h4 check. King is forced back to g1, and now you sacrifice a second bishop to further expose white's king. Bishop captures g2. With the threat, queen h1, checkmate. White is forced to play the move f3. The second bishop sacrifice is poison. If white accepts the second bishop sacrifice, then he falls prey to a very nice Zwischenzug, first with a rook lift. After king takes g2, black plays queen g4 check, forcing the king to the h-file. After king h2, black now plays rook d5, threatening rook h5 with a major piece checkmate. The only defense to this is queen captures c5. After queen captures c5, black doesn't capture the queen immediately, but first plays a Zwischenzug. He plays Queen h5 check, forcing the king to the g file. Queen g5 check with a double attack against the king and the knight. Black then takes the queen and then takes the knight. He'll be up in force and have a winning game. In addition, White's king will be extremely exposed. So back to the main variation, and now we understand why he couldn't play king takes bishop. Instead, he played f3 in order to give his king the escape square f2. Black played rook e8. This is what is referred to as a quiet move. The move isn't immediately threatening anything, but it does do things, and that's what a quiet move is. It sets things up, and it can be a very, very devastating move. If now king takes g2, then the rook penetrates to e2 check, followed by queen h2 checkmate. After rook e8, White is forced to blockade the e-file, and he plays knight e4. Black now plays queen h1 check, king f2, and now Black captures the rook on f1. If White recaptures on f1, then after queen h2 check, his queen is skewered. So what to do? Well, White starts a counterattack of his own. He plays the move d5. This opens up the long diagonal, and after the further move queen c3, White can see himself checkmating Black. So now the question is, should Black start to panic? And this is really an example of what can happen when you set up a fianchetto pawn structure and your black squared bishop is missing. If you lose your dark squared bishop, then all your dark squares become weak. So be very careful when fianchettoing to make sure that you keep your fianchetto bishop. Should Black panic? He should play f5. If he tries to exchange queens with the move queen g2 check, he doesn't win as easily as he thinks. For example, if queen g2 check, then after king e3, queen captures c2, rook captures c2, f5, White has the move king f2, and there's still a scrap on his hands. So instead, after the move f5, White decided, well, great, what else to do? It looks like he's mating. He plays the move queen c3, threatening checkmate in one move on g7. Black had anticipated this and played queen g2 check. After queen g2 check, king was forced to go to e3, otherwise it would be mate on one on e2. Now Black sacrificed an exchange with rook takes e4 check. Forced recapture, f takes e4, and now queen g3 check. White has only one option, king d2, and he walks into a lovely mate with queen f2 check, followed by queen e2 mate. This example shows how tremendously aggressive and what a wonderful attacker the queen can be. Indeed, when in the 14th century the rules of chess were changed to allow the queen such great attacking mobility, the French called her the Mad Queen. In our last scene, I showed you the strengths of the hanging pawns. Now I'm going to show you the weakness of the hanging pawns. Playing with the hanging pawns is like playing with fire. As Dr. Seibert-Tarash said, the player who is afraid to play with hanging pawns should not play chess. Also, later in the scene, I'm going to be showing you what I like to refer to as the master pawn structure, which I used in a game with former world champion Mikhail Tal. But first, more insights into hanging pawns. As I said earlier, when you have a spatial disadvantage, you're defending. You're the defender. When you're playing against hanging pawns, you're more often than not the defender. There are two strategical keys to keep in mind when defending against a hanging pawn. The first is trade minor pieces. The second is try to force your opponent to move his c-pawn. In this situation, White traded minor pieces with the maneuver knight e5, attacking the rook. After rook d6, queen a4 was played, purpose of which was to trade this knight for that knight. After queen a4, black played queen takes e5, and after queen takes a5, white's position has brightened considerably. Your fianchetto bishop is now on a beautiful long diagonal, bearing down on the target d5. The queen is in on a very active square. It attacks the c-pawn c5. After queen takes a5, black defended with the move rook c8. Again, white tries to provoke the c-pawn to move forward, plays knight a4, attacking the pawn on c5. Black now chose to defend the pawn with rook c6, sacrificing the pawn on d5 in the hopes that he'll have play on the long diagonal. If he had played instead knight e4, this wouldn't have worked, although it comes close. After the move knight e4, defending c5, as well as attacking the rook on d2, white could have captured on e4, bishop e4, queen takes e4. The capture with the pawn is impossible, and the purpose of knight e4 was to keep the long diagonal open. White would play knight captures c5, forking bishop and queen. After rook takes c5, queen takes c5, d4, it looks like black has a very dangerous attack. He's threatening white with checkmate in one move. But white can defend that instantly with the move f3. After f3, attacking the queen, the two white rooks defend white's king, and in addition, the rook on d6 is attacked. Thus, knight e4 would not have worked. So, back to the main variation. Back at the main variation, we see that white has now begun to focus his attack on the hanging pawns. After bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, rook takes d5, black would have enough compensation on the long diagonal. Instead, white played rook c2. It would have been a mistake to fork black with the move knight b6, because this would have allowed a cute counterpin. Knight b6 allows queen c7, pinning the knight to the queen. White would lose, and so white didn't play knight b6. Instead, white continued with his main idea, which was to provoke black to move his c-pawn, after which he would be strategically lost. So black does what he can to resist this. He plays queen e7, again inviting the fork knight b6. White plays rook c1, and black is unable to prevent his pawn from being forced to advance. After c4, white now realized his aims. His aims were to force black to play c4. Now white switched his attack to the backward pawn on the d-file, d5. He focused on the target. Rook d1. After rook d1, rook d8, rook d2. This was a mistake. Well, I shouldn't say that. This was an inaccuracy. Better would have been rook d4 and then rook d2. Later in the game, he gets the same setup, only a tempo less. White played rook d2. Rook d6. Now, all of white's pieces bear down on the weakness d5. The queen on a5, the knight on c3, the doubled rooks, and the bishop on g2. Black played queen e6. White blockaded on d4 with the move rook d4. Black now waited because he's completely tied up to the defense of his pawn. He played rook d6, d7. White played rook d2. White is much superior in the position. After g6, which was a mistake, it would have been better to repeat the position passively, came the move knight a4, with the threat of a triple fork on c5. The knight on c5 would hit the queen on e6, the rook on d7, the bishop on b7. After knight a4, queen e7, knight c5, we have a case of an overworked piece. The rook on d7 must defend both d5 and the bishop on b7. He's performing double duty, so to speak. Whenever a piece is forced to perform this double duty, he can always be susceptible for a tactic called an overworked piece. Here, all white has to do is remove that rook from the defense of the d5 pawn, and the d5 pawn falls. After knight c5, rook c7, knight takes b7, rook takes b7. White has his choice: capture the a6 pawn or capture the d5 pawn. As I mentioned earlier, center pawns are more valuable. Capture that center pawn. Bishop captures d5. This sets up black for a discovery. If now black plays the move rook b5, then after queen takes d8, bishop takes f7 check, white regains his queen, he wins an exchange. He wins a major piece for a minor piece. So after bishop takes d5, black was forced to play knight takes d5, then came rook takes d5, rook takes d5, queen takes d5. Black found himself in a major piece endgame, a pawn down, and with split pawns. He quickly lost the game after rook c7, queen a8 check. We'll now go on to our final dynamic pawn structure, the master pawn structure. Our next pawn skeleton is what I like to call the master pawn structure. Why do I call it the master pawn structure? Well, it's so bad that either a master or a fool are the people who use it. The master pawn structure violates a classical principle. The classical principle is always aim towards the center, capture towards the center. The master structure does precisely the opposite. In this situation, the pawn on f2 is captured away from the center towards g3. A more typical example of the master pawn structure is that it usually involves the e-pawns. When a player is forced to play f2 takes g3, his e-pawn, usually on e3 or e6, whether white or black, becomes isolated and weak. So why would anybody want the master pawn structure if it's so bad and it violates all of these classical principles? Well, it does do some nice things. First, it prevents checkmates on the h line. It also opens up the f-file for a rook, and you can do a quicken attack, usually a sacrifice of an exchange on f6. Anyway, in the example that I'll use to feature the master pawn structure, I was white against former world champion Mikhail Tal. Tal was in a bit of a quandary. White has a big threat in the position, and unfortunately, it was black's move. My threat in the position is to play rook captures d5. With the capture of the rook on d5, he would be forced to respawn cd, and then after queen d2, I would attack the weak child on d5 and try to follow it up with the move queen d4 when I would be on the long diagonal to which black is particularly vulnerable. With these thoughts in mind, Tal decided the best thing he could do is exchange pieces and get into an endgame to avoid being exploited on the long diagonal. Tal played bishop captures g3. He had a second option also, and that was to exchange rooks. If Tal had played rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and seeing how that he's afraid of the move queen d4, if he played the move bishop e5, then after bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, Tal would have found himself in a very, very difficult ending of queen and knight versus queen and bishop. Also, the bishop on f5 is a very bad bishop. The reason it's a bad bishop is because of so many black pawns on light squares. Count the number of pawns on light squares, and you'll understand why that bishop is bad. So in most endings, a queen and a knight work much better together than a queen and a bishop because they complement each other. they have different powers. Whereas the queen and the bishop can make a battery on the diagonal only, a queen and a knight can work to cover all 64 squares. So it's a nice complement. After bishop takes g3, I surprised Tal. He had expected only h captures g3, and after an exchange of rooks, he had anticipated being able to play queen d7 and getting into a bishops of opposite color endgame, which he could draw easily. I therefore chose to use the master pawn structure. Although I'm not worried about mates down the h-line or anything like that, I do have specific game reasons for doing what I did. That is to say, when a player takes the master pawn structure, you should have a good reason for doing it. After fg, rook takes d1, queen takes d1. We're in a queen and opposite color bishop ending. We've just transposed out of the middle game now. And the most important feature of this ending is the relative safety of each of the kings. Whereas white's king has wonderful pawn shield, wonderful pawn shelter, black does not. He played queen d7 in order to try to exchange queens. I played queen e1. If now bishop g4, simply h3, and the bishop has to go back because he can't play queen d1, my queen's protected. After queen e1, Tal relocated his bishop, played bishop e6, attacking my pawn on a2. Remembering a principle not to put pawns on the same color as your bishop, I played the move b3. After b3, Tal advanced his majority on the queen side with the move c5. This was a mistake. What's going to happen in the position is that his king is going to be vulnerable on the dark squares, and he should run. He should begin at once with the move king f7, followed by king e8, and run like crazy towards the queen side. After all, running is man's oldest defense. After c5, I played the move h3. The purpose of this move was to prepare king h2 and to avoid all possibilities of perpetual check. Perpetual check is a forced repetition of the position, which he may have after queen d1. So h3, preparing to hide my king. To h3, b5, I now played queen f1 with a threat queen f6, followed by queen h8. In addition, I'm putting pressure on his pawn on b5. Played b4, attacking my bishop on c3. Played bishop e5, threat of queen f6. He played queen d8 in order to parry that threat. And I played queen b5, attacking c5. Now what has happened is, since he's advanced his pawns, they've become weaker. And I'll explain this in our study segment about two motivations and pawn weaknesses. So, but that's skipping ahead. Prepare yourselves for that. After queen b5, I attack c5. He defends with the move queen c8, also preparing possible bishop sacrifices. In any event, I wanted to play it safe, so I played the move king h2, protecting my pawn. And now, if you notice, my king's in a beautiful little pocket, one of the assets of playing the master pawn structure. In this position, he's in terrible trouble because there's no real defense he has against the move bishop d6, and all of these pawns in the dark squares are going to fall. Played bishop d5. He was in time pressure. He didn't have very much time at this moment. And I played bishop d6. a6, queen a5. There's nothing black can really do. King f7. And after bishop takes c5, white's strategy of playing on the dark squares has paid dividends. He's going to capture all of these pawns on c5 and b4. The game was rather brutal. It finished queen c6, queen takes b4, bishop e6, bishop d4, bishop d4, h5, and now All white had to do was, once again, attack on the dark squares. I played queen b8, king e7, queen e5, and there was no defense against the threat of queen f6 check and queen takes g6. One of the things that really puzzled most viewers about the game is how Tal was so easily lost, and what happened. After all, wasn't I attacking queen and queen versus bishop and bishop? No, because what happens to the defender is this. When it's an opposite colored bishop situation, it's almost as if he's playing a piece down, because the defender cannot challenge the attacker on the same diagonal. So the defender's bishop is worth almost nothing, and in some cases you can see it looks as if a player is actually a piece down. You can try this in some of your games. There are two motivations in chess, attack and defense. How to play the attack and how to play the defense is going to be extremely important for anybody who wants to become a chess master. There are 4 rules of attack. Rule number 1, don't exchange attacking pieces for defensive ones unnecessarily. Rule number 2, you must have an advantage in some element in order to attack. Consciously ask yourself, what is my advantage? The third rule of attack, the major aim of most attacks is to provoke a pawn weaknesses. And what am I talking about? I'm talking specifically about forcing your opponent to move a pawn. And finally, the fourth rule of attack, apply the force count. Consciously count the number of pieces attacking as opposed to the number of pieces defending. Remember, the defensive king is worth 3.5. Now let's go to the studio for study segment 4. Material advantage is the most concrete advantage you can possess. Remember, chess is a very materialistic game. The player who is ahead in force, or what I call the overall force count, is going to win 90% of the time. What do I mean overall force count? Well, let's take a look. In this situation, white has equal number of knights, bishops, rooks, and queens. He has 4 pawns versus 4 on the king side, but 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So white is up a pawn in force. Whenever ahead in force, the key principle is exchange pieces. So white has to exchange pieces. Watch how he does that. He begins with rook takes a8. Rook takes a8 would be a mistake because after queen takes c6, white would win 2 minor pieces for a rook. A big advantage. Always do that if you have the possibility. To rook takes a8, black is forced to play knight takes e5. White trades another piece, rook takes d8, rook takes d8. White now plays bishop e2, leaving black with several choices. One choice is knight d3. As we see over here, this subvariation wouldn't work out at all. In fact, after knight d3, rook d1, black can resign at once because the knight is pinned and he'll lose quite soon. So knight d3 doesn't work. What else? What about knight d7? Well, that doesn't work either. This allows white several pins. If knight d7, then white plays rook d1, attacking the queen. After queen e7, white comes down, queen c7, with a cross pin. Black is pinned on the 7th rank as well as on the d file. After queen c7, king f8, bishop b5, king e8. Black is all tied up, and now white wins the piece with the maneuver rook takes d7, rook takes d7, queen c8 check, queen d8, and now, because of the cross pin, white wins a piece with bishop takes d7 check, king e7, trade queen, and white is a piece ahead. So back to our main variation. What can black do? Well, quite clearly he can neither retreat the knight nor move it forward. So he plays the move queen d2. The purpose of this move is to play queen takes e3 check, followed by rook d2. After queen d2, white exchanges queens, totally in line with his plan. He's ahead in force. He wants to trade pieces. Rook takes d2, king f1. The knight cannot go to d3 because of rook c8 check and rook d8. So instead, it went to d7. After knight d7, rook c8 check, king g7, rook d8. Black was in a pin again. So now to get out of the pin, he has to bring his king to e7. He plays king f6, bishop b5, king e7, and now white exchanges everything on d7, beginning with rook takes d7, rook takes d7, bishop takes d7, king takes d7. And now white has managed to get into a king and pawn endgame where he's a pawn ahead, and after a4 he wins very easily. If you're home viewing this tape with a friend, take the time with your friend and have him playing out the losing position and you get the good end. See how easy it is to win with that extra pawn. So remember, the underlying principle is the player who's head in force is going to win 90% of the time, and furthermore, once you're ahead in force, trade pieces. As I've mentioned before, one of the best ways to determining an attack's success or failure is by dividing the board in half. Draw an imaginary line between the E and D files and count the number of pieces on one side of the board. In this situation, white has 5, black 3.5, 4.5. It's unlikely that this force is going to overwhelm the defensive force. Let's move over here. In this situation, white has 9, black has 4.5. You can bet your bottom dollar that the queen is going to overwhelm this defensive force. We'll now be taking a look at attacking forces overwhelming defensive forces and the aim or using the principle of forcing upon weakness. This features Greco's sacrifice. Greco's sacrifice is a bit more hidden than the other combinations because when you divide the board in half, white doesn't figure to have a preponderance of attacking force against the defensive forces, save for these two pieces, bishop on f4, knight on f3. But two long-range pieces, the queen and the bishop, support the attack. The sacrifice begins with a move, bishop takes h7, check. One of the key elements of the Greco sacrifice is the missing defensive knight. This knight that usually stays on f6, that's such a good defender of h7, is gone. After bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7. Now we have knight g5 check. After knight g5 check, black has two possible answers. 3, actually. The first one is to play passively with king g8. In our first subvariation, after king g8, white is able to use a Zwischenzug to create a checkmate. He begins with the move queen h5, threatening immediate mate queen h7. After queen h5, rook e8, instead of playing check with the queen and check again with the queen, white first plays queen f7 check, forcing king into the corner, king h8, queen h5 check, forcing the king back to g8, then mate in 3, queen h7 check, and you figure out the rest. Back to our main variation, and after knight g5 check, black can't walk into a discovered check, king h6, because that allows knight takes e6 check, picking up the queen. Instead, he plays king g6. This allows queen b1 check. After queen b1 check, Black plays f5. Now white is able to use the rule of en passant. e5 captures f6, discover check, and king on g6. Black now has two choices, king h5 or king takes f6. If he plays king takes f6, he walks into a one-move checkmate with rook on e1 captures e6 checkmate. So clearly, king f6 is not possible. Instead, king h5, king h6, queen h7 checkmate. So the queen, that is all the way over here on b1, shoots down to the king side and further exposes the black king. Black king is now forced to go to g4. King g4, knight captures e6. White is threatening several mates in one, including h3 checkmate, queen h3 checkmate. So black gave up. This example, we demonstrate the principle of forcing a pawn weakness. White has an advantage in attacking force on the king side, and all he has to do is force a breach in black's shield. He plays the move, queen g5, threatening checkmate on g7. The pawn on f7 is pinned by the bishop on b3, so that the only move to defend mate in one is g6. After g6, we play queen f6, threatening knight h6 mate and queen g7 mate. Black is forced to capture on f5, and after bishop d4, white threatens queen g7 checkmate and queen h8 checkmate. So far we've seen what can happen when an attacking force meets a lesser defensive force. Let's see what will happen when equal forces meet. This is a typical example of a hedgehog defense on black's part. White's attack on the king side has begun to take on ominous overtones, so black offers an exchange of queens with queen c7 to e8. What white now has to remember is one of the principal rules of attack. Don't exchange pieces unnecessarily. White plays queen h5 with a hidden threat. The threat that he has, as we see in our first board over here, the threat that white has is to play the move e5. After e5, white is threatening mate, queen takes h7 mate. Black plays g6. After g6, e takes d6. Now, no matter how black captures this pawn on d6, whether with the queen or whether with the bishop, something terrible is going to happen on the square g6. For example, bishop takes d6, bishop takes g6, threatening mate in 2. After bishop g6, hg6, rook takes g6 check, f takes g6, queen takes g6 check, king f8, and you find the mate in 2. So back to our main variation. After queen h5, white's threat is e5. So black is forced to create a breach or a pawn weakness in his position. He's forced to play g6. Now after g6, something has got to happen to white's thinking. White has to realize that his attacking forces are not going to overwhelm black. So he's going to have to do something about the defenders. What about this bishop on f8? Well, I've told you not to exchange attacking pieces for defensive pieces unnecessarily. But what happens when there's a very good defender? Then, by all means, exchange it. White plays bishop h6. After bishop h6, in order to get out of the pin on the g file, black plays king h8. White plays bishop captures f8, seemingly leaving his queen in capture. But what happens if black captures it? If black captures it with g captures h5, white then sets black up for a discover check. After bishop g7 check, king g8, bishop f6, discovered check. White regains his queen, and black's pawn structure has been compromised. His endgame would be very bad. Black doesn't want a very bad endgame, and so after bishop captures f8, he responds, rook captures f8. White now pursues his attack on the weakened dark squares with queen h6, with a threat rook h3. Black then brings his queen over to the defense of the king side with queen f6, intending queen g7. So now, White should take a look at this and he says, hey, I'm not breaking through. What happens when an attack doesn't break through on one side of the board? Well, what you should do is redirect the attack. Since the attack's not happening here on the king side, perhaps in the center or on the queen side. White redirects his attack. He plays bishop b1, attacking d6. If black now responds queen e7, defending the half-backward pawn on d6, then white plays queen e3 with a threat to b6 and a threat of playing queen d4 check, picking up the d6 pawn. So, the rule of thumb here is when you have a good defender, exchange it if you're the attacker, and redirect the attack if you see that the defender has enough defenders. Keep in mind that the defensive and attacking principles that I presented so far are just that, principles. They cover the majority of positions, not all of them. In the game that I showed you earlier on tape 1, Michael wrote, this knight on a5 is a key defender. So, watch how my attacking possibilities open up as I exchange an attacker for a defender. I played knight e5 in order to exchange black's knight. This trade would leave Michael vulnerable on the a file, as is often the case when a player castles queenside. With the key defender gone, my attacking possibilities have brightened considerably. I'm now threatening queen a7. Distracted by my threat, Michael made a terrible move. I've now won a pawn, and my attack is about to crash through. Enough about attacking principles. Let's go back to the studio and learn some defensive ones. So far, I've spoke about attacking principles at length. The reason I've done that is because I want to teach you how to attack. I don't want to teach you how to defend, but you should know the defensive principles nonetheless. This example is an example used by Wilhelm Steinitz, first official world chess champion. He laid down the laws of defense. He said, 1, the defense must be conducted economically. If you put too many pieces on the king's side, too many pieces will get in one another's way. Too few pieces will be unable to stem the assault. The second defensive principle, he said, is not to create pawn weaknesses. This is a key. And what did he mean? He meant don't move your pawns unless absolutely forced. If you're forced to move your pawns, make the damage as limited as possible. In this example, black clearly has, if we divide the board in half, the preponderance of force on the king's side. He threatens to play the move g4 and g3. How to defend? Well, the natural defensive move is h3. Does this correspond to the principles we've just laid out? Certainly not. The best defensive move would have been the move king on g1 to h1, as we see here. After king h1, the possible variations would be g4, attacking the bishop, bishop e2. After bishop e2, if black captured our e4 pawn, then after rook captures e4, f3, G captures F3, rook captures F3, rook F4, G3, forcing black to exchange an attacker for a defender. Rook captures F3, bishop captures F3. White can be confident that he can protect his king as he has his bishop on the long diagonal. He has a very defensible game. On the other hand, if black did not play rook takes F2, if black did not play rook takes E4, and instead played rook takes F2, then white would simply play rook takes F2. For example, queen takes F2, and white would recapture his sacrificed pawn with bishop captures G4, and again would have no particular difficulties. The real point to the defense is seen after bishop captures F2. My assistant Dave, who has set up the board for me so I could go right through this, has shown that after bishop takes F2, G3, black is forced to play rook captures E4, king G2, and black's in a terrible pin on the F line, or if not rook captures E4, but instead queen H6, black anticipates that after G3 captures F4, he'll mate white with bishop G3. But we don't have to capture the rook. And that was the point to the entire defense, king H1, that after king H1, bishop takes F2, G3, queen H6, counterattack, the best form of defense. White plays the move queen D5. After queen D5, black has nothing better than to allow a perpetual check, which is a draw by repetition. Bishop takes G3, queen captures E5 check. Black can interpose queens because after an exchange of queens he'll lose his bishop. Black's forced to play rook G7. Then after queen E8 check, black is forced to retreat his rook. And again, white repeats the position, queen E5 check. Whenever the position is repeated 3 times, we call it 3 times repetition, and the game ends in a draw. Otherwise, such a game could go on indefinitely or indeed forever. Back to our main line. Why was H3 such a bad move? Well, for one thing, it creates a target. Now black has something to work on. After H3, black blew white away with the move G4. There are 2 variations now. If white plays bishop captures G4, then black sacrifices an exchange with rook on G8 captures G4, H captures G4, rook captures F2, and because of his control of the G1, B6 diagonal, black is going to mate white soon. You figure that one out. And on the other hand, if instead of bishop captures G4, we play H captures G4, then we allow black to open up the game. After H captures G4, black plays H5. Play the position out with a friend and see if you can defend against black's threats of H captures G4, followed by G3. Steinitz' defensive principles didn't tell us what to do when we find ourselves behind in force. And quite frankly, there's not a lot we can do. We just have to complicate the game. But one thing to keep in mind, when you're behind in force, one of the worst things you can do is try to attack your opponent's king. That is to say, commit a kamikaze attack against your opponent's king. Because you have to put yourself in your opponent's shoes. What is he thinking? He's saying to himself, boy, I'm ahead in force. The only way I'm really going to lose this game is if I get mated. Therefore, he's going to start making precautionary moves around his king. So what you should try to do is aim your attacks away from his king. We'll now move on to space, how to get it and how to use it. turning an advantage in space into the more tangible advantage of force has become a veritable science. What you have to do is continue to control more and more and more squares. Tie your opponent down to a weakness. Probe that weakness, tie him up, and then suddenly switch attacks. In this classical example by Nimzovich, who was playing a classical French defense, he played Queen G6. If you notice, white is completely tied down to the backward pawn on G3. In addition, black has a terrible threat in the position. In our first sub-variation, he is threatening to place white in a state of Zugzwang. Zugzwang is a German word that means any move you make is a bad move, but you have to make a move, so you're forced to make a bad move. Black is threatening to play H captures G3, and after knight captures G3, rook captures H3, king captures H3. After queen H6 check, king G2, queen H4, black says to white, it's your move. What are you going to do? If white moves any of his pieces, he'll lose them. If he plays bishop E3, he interferes with his queen's defense of G3. All he can do is push a pawn, and then black waits. Your move again. So, state of Zugzwang is a terrible state to be in. White avoids that in his main variation, back to the main variation, by playing the move bishop E3. If now black exchanges on G3, then white intends to play his bishop back to G1 and to H2 and to oscillate back and forth whenever it's his turn. Therefore, black refuses to exchange pieces unnecessarily. Instead, he suddenly switches attack. He plays queen on G6 to A6, attacking the isolated pawn on A2. In addition, black now has a threat of trapping white's queen. Whenever you get into cramped positions, your pieces lacking for space are easier to trap. And this certainly is no exception. With this terrible threat, knight B2, white tries to defend by playing the move bishop F2, further defending G3. Black captures the isolated pawn, A2. Again, keep in mind that what black has done is completely tied white up, switched flanks, and captured the pawn on the other side of the flank. After queen captures A2, white's trying to untangle his pieces with the move bishop E1. This allows black to push on the queen side, A5. After A5, white gets out of the pin on the G line by playing king F1. Black now puts white in an absolute pin on the first with queen B1 with the threat knight D2. White played knight G1 in order to give his king the square E2. Black didn't bother to capture the exchange that he could have had with the move knight D2, preferring instead to push his passed pawn. After A4, king E2, A3, rook F1, A2, the pawn ran and scored a touchdown. When we deal with space, there are a few specific principles I want you to keep in mind. The first thing is, remember, when you have a spatial advantage, you're the attacker. Your pieces are more valuable. Don't exchange pieces. Let your opponent enjoy his cramp. Second point, because you have a spatial advantage, open the position up. That means force pawn exchanges. Both sides have castled on opposite flanks. Black the king side, white the queen side. When you castle on opposite flanks, this is usually the time that you experience the most exciting games in chess, because that allows both players to attack with abandon. What white will try to do is open up the king side, black the queen side. In a situation in which both players are castled on opposite flanks, it's been my experience that the player with the edge in the center is a big favorite to win the game. Here, what white is trying to do is open up the king side. Plays G5, trying to force pawn exchanges. After h captures g5, h4, black has a problem. How to keep the king side closed? Should he play g captures h4, or should he play g4? In our first subvariation, we find that if he plays the move g4, then after h5, white forces open the h-file anyway. For example, g5, h6. Black is obligated to take on h6, and after whatever captures on h6, bishop captures g5, black's completely lost. Why is black in such a quandary? Why is he having so many difficulties? The reason is he's violated one of Steinitz' principles, which was he has too many pieces defending his king. Specifically, the knight on f6 would have been much better placed on the outpost c5. As it is, the pieces get in each other's way. After h4, black plays bishop g4. White now opens up the h-file by playing h captures g5, discovered check. Knight h5 is the best move, and after knight h5, white brings more pieces over to the king side, plays knight e2. After knight e2, black is trying to get out of the cramped situation he's in along the h-file, so he plays knight e7 in order to give his king the square g8. After knight e7, white plays rook h4, gaining a tempo against the bishop on g4. Black is forced to respond to this by playing queen d7. Now white brings his other rook over to the h-file, preparing to break through along the h-line. Black sees his impending doom, so he tries to run with king g8. And again, we have a typical example of what happens from a big spatial disadvantage. Pieces get trapped. And as a result, white sacrifices an exchange in order to trap black's queen. After rook takes g4, queen takes g4, white now plays bishop h3. If the queen moves to h4, then after bishop e6 check, black loses his queen. He must play queen f3. After queen f3, we play rook f1, and the queen is trapped. Black plays knight takes g3. And instead of capturing the queen immediately on f3, white first throws in a Zwischenzug, an in-between move. Hits him with the old bishop e6 check to drive black's king back to the h-line. After bishop e6 check, king h8, rook captures f3, rook captures f3, knight captures g3, rook captures g3. You go ahead and find the checkmate in 3. The most usual way of exploiting a spatial advantage is to focus your attack on a pawn. Here, white plays the move queen h3 with a double attack against h7. How is black to defend? Should he defend with h6 or move his queen? If he defends with h6, in our first subvariation, white simply sacrifices his bishop. Plays bishop captures h6. After g takes h6, black's king is exposed to a rook lift, and after queen captures h6, white is going to play rook e5 and rook g5 next. So, back to the main line. In the main line, black realizes that he can't play h6, so he moves his queen out of the pin. He plays queen d6. White captures the knight, doubling black's pawn. And now, what white has to be careful about is to avoid temptation. so tempting to play queen takes h7 check and allow the king on g8 to run away. Instead, the best move is queen h6. This sets up a very typical mating net. After queen h6, white threatens to play bishop on d3, captures h7 check, forcing black into a discovered check. After bishop g6 check, king comes back to g8, queen h7, and queen f7 checkmate. So, now that this has been set up, this mating pattern has been set up, black stops that by playing f5. Now again, we have a rook lift. Rook e3, threatening to play rook g3. After rook e3, queen captures d4. Black intends to defend upon the long diagonal. So, what white has to do is kick the queen off the long diagonal. He plays c3. Black now gave up. If his queen moves to h8, it's checkmate in 2 moves with rook g3. Anywhere else the queen moves allows rook g3 followed by queen g7 checkmate. So black gave up. In our next example, we'll see how white exploits a space advantage by attacking all of black's pawn shield. Again, to reinforce the key principle, focus and attack pawn weaknesses. Focus and attack pawns. Here, white has a massive spatial advantage on the king side. On top of that, he also has a big advantage in the center, in space. For that reason, he doesn't fear counterattack. White begins with the move rook g3, threatening queen takes h6. Black gets out of the pin with the move king h7. White brings up his other rook in order to double rooks on the g file. Black, anticipating that, plays rook g8. White redirects his attack on the f-pawn now. Threat, rook takes f7. Black plays g6. After g6, white plays knight g5 check. Knight g5 check, black has 2 moves. Queen takes g5 or king g7. Queen takes g5 will be our main line. What would happen if king g7? Well, it's quite simple. If king g7, white would simply win black's queen with the move rook takes f7 check. Because after rook f7, queen f7, knight takes, black is unable to recapture white's queen because of the pin on the g file. So, back to the main variation. After queen takes g5, white now played rook captures f7 check with a double attack against the knight on d7 and the king. Black has 2 choices, king h8 or rook g7. Let's see what would have happened on rook g7. In case of rook g7, white would capture black's queen, exploiting a double pin. The rook can't be captured because the pawn is pinned, and if the g6 pawn captures on h5, then after rook on g captures g7 check, white will capture black's knight and emerge a rook ahead. Back to our main variation. After king h8, white simply made a major piece mate by the move queen captures g5. I hope you can guess the rest. Our final example of space features the Greco sacrifice, which we showed you earlier. The Greco sacrifice is named after a leading player of the 1600s, Greco. Today's grandmasters are trying to build up the classical knowledge that has been built up over the centuries. Why would anybody sacrifice material if force is the most important element? Well, there are 2 objectives whenever we sacrifice: to checkmate or to regain the sacrificed material with interest. Whenever you're ahead in space, it's very important to strike quickly, and that's exactly what white does here. He does this by starting a sacrifice with the move d5. It's amazing in such a quiet position that the game can suddenly explode into tactics. After d5, knight takes d5, the e-pawn is pinned, the bishop on e7 is not defended. Bishop takes e7, knight recaptures on e7. Our trusty Greco sacrifice, bishop captures h7 check, is now played. After king takes h7, knight g5, black has two choices, either going back to g8 or coming up to g6. If black comes up to g6, in our first sub-variation, he can be mated in one of two ways. After queen h5 check, king f6, white has the lovely option of knight h7 checkmate or knight ge4 checkmate. After knight g5 check, king g8, white now follows up his pawn sacrifice with an exchange sacrifice. Plays rook captures d7 in order to prevent the knight from coming to f6 and defending the king. After rook captures d7, queen captures d7, white now plays queen h5, threatening mate in 1. Black gets out of the mate with rook d8, and then comes queen takes f7 check. After queen f7 check, king's forced into the corner. Obviously, white would like to follow it up with the move knight h5. He can't do it right away, because if he does, we can well understand why black recaptured with the queen on d7. If white plays knight h5 at once, he simply falls to a back rank checkmate. So, obviously we can't play knight h5. White's main variation, then, is h4, getting out of the back rank mate and preparing for the move knight h5. After h4, black has two options: queen e8, which will be our main line, or knight f5. In the case of knight f5, what we have over here is white simply captures on f5, and after knight captures f5, e captures f5, then you drive your opponent's king out with the move queen h5 check, king is forced to run, king g8, check, 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 king d6, rook d1 check, skewering black's queen. I trust my students out there are going to be able to solve that one. Let's go back to the main variation. After queen e8, white now plays knight h5. After knight h5, white threatens mate in 1 with queen g7 mate. Black has two choices: capture white's queen or defend with queen f8. Queen f8 is our main line. For the sub-variation, queen captures f7. Black is forced to walk into a fork. Knight takes f7 check. King g8. Knight captures d8. Bishop b7. Bishop d7. Knight to b7. At the end of this whole thing, if you count up the pawns, white has won 1 in the force count. So for a very long combination, white has won in the force count and probably will win the endgame. Still, he has work ahead of him. Back to our main variation, however, black chose to defend with queen f8, seeing that the endgame was more than likely lost. After queen f8, white made a clearance move. He moved the knight to f6 with a gain of tempo because he's threatening queen h5 checkmate. If now queen captures f7, knight captures f7 to knight mate. So knight f5 was forced. Then came queen h5 check. knight h6, queen g6, threatening mate in 1 with queen h7. Black is forced to move his queen into capture, and rather than do that, he resigned. Now you see why the Greco sacrifice is as popular as it is old. Keep in mind, the key thing that's missing is a defensive knight that makes the h7 square vulnerable to the bishop sacrifice. To sum up, space advantages. What you have to do when you have a space advantage is to seek to increase your space control. Keep gaining squares. Once you have your opponent pinned down to a particular target, suddenly switch fronts. It's unlikely that he'll be able to respond to your threats. Any player can fall into a spatially inferior position. When this happens, you must know how to overcome your difficulties. I'd like to give you now some specific principles for when you have a space disadvantage. First, find an effective square for each piece, then put him there. Avoid creating pawn weaknesses. If you have pawn weaknesses, exchange them or defend them. Another principle, sacrifice for counterplay. The most common forms of sacrifice are a pawn or an exchange. Exchange pieces. Seek relief in the endgame. In this example, white has a tremendous advantage in space. If he gets a chance to play rook d1, the game is all but over. So, black has to relieve his spatial inferiority. How to do it? Well, he sacrifices an exchange. He plays the move, knight e8. After knight e8, white has several choices. The first is, what would happen on the simple retreat, queen g3? In our first subvariation, we show what would happen. After queen g3, this would be a bad move, because after f6, white simply has a bishop that would get locked in. So, queen g3 will not do. Back to the main variation. In the main variation, we have bishop captures d8. White also has one other choice, and that is queen captures f8. Take a look at that first. If queen captures f8, sorry, it's been a long day, huh? After queen captures f8, black now plays queen takes g5 check, king h1, and then after queen f5 or queen h5, black is at least equal. With your friend, you should play this position out to see who you would prefer, white or black. Back to our main line, after bishop takes d8, black plays knight captures d6, and white double attacks the rook and the knight. Black had anticipated this and plays knight takes c4. After knight c4, bishop captures f8, rook captures bishop. We have a situation in which black sacrificed force. He sacrificed a rook, 5, for a bishop, 3, and a pawn, 4. So he sacrificed one force. But he has reduced his spatial disadvantage, and now he's ready to play d5. The situation is approximately, as I would say, dynamically equal. Again, this is a good situation to play with a friend. In my other game with Michael Rode from the US Open Blitz Championship, Mike has a large advantage in space. I know that I have to exchange pieces. First, I swap a bishop for his centralized knight. Then I offer a trade of dark-squared bishops, which he should avoid, since two bishops are usually stronger than a bishop and a knight. After I exchange two pieces, my spatial problem has almost disappeared, and Mike is left with a bad bishop. Now I trade a set of rooks. Michael trades queens in order to give me isolated double pawns. But he then refuses to exchange the remaining rooks because he would be left with just his bad bishop against my strong knight. By avoiding this trade, however, he lets my rook penetrate. And now I stand better and go on to win the game. Now that you're familiar with space, let's see what to do about our third element, time. We'll now look at the third element, time. What does it mean to have an advantage in time, and how to use that advantage? We say we have an advantage in time if we have more pieces mobilized, more pieces and pawns mobilized than that of our opponent. Having an advantage in time means nothing unless you use the advantage in order to attack. What do I mean by attack? I don't mean a bridge-burning assault on the enemy king. All I mean is to heighten the conflict, try to open the position, create tactics. That's what gambits are all about. Gambits are sacrifices in order to make your advantage in time much more clear. It is in the opening and the middle game that time is of the essence. In addition to the attacking principles I've already mentioned, there are 3 additional ones for whenever you have an advantage in time. 1. Don't lock or close the position. Force pawn exchanges. Be more aware of sacrifices because you'll have more opportunities to sacrifice. Now to our first example. In this situation, black is much more mobilized than white, and white's whole queenside is sitting here completely underdeveloped. Black, using the principle of attack, provokes a pawn weakness. Plays the move queen h4, threatening queen captures h2, checkmate. Our main variation will be g3. What happens if he plays h3? This will be our first subvariation. In case of h3, black now has a target, this h-pawn. He plays g5 in order to play h5 and g4, opening up the king side. After g5, white would probably try to keep the king side closed with the move knight g4. After knight g4, knight takes g4, queen takes g4. Black has an interesting possibility of being able to use the king's rook by exchanging on g4, then driving white's king on the h-file with the move knight e2 check. He can set up Anastasia's mate with h5. Back to the main variation. In the main variation, in order to avoid the consequences of h3, white plays g3. Black now plays queen h3. In order to get rid of this knight on d4, white played c3, trying to force black to retreat or to capture the bishop. Instead, black made a sacrifice. He sacrificed for time. He played the move h5, intent upon opening up the position after h4. White captured the knight, and after c captures d4, black continued h4. He's now threatening to make this rook a formidable attacker on the h-file. White readied himself with queen e2 for a discovered check. What white was hoping for is that now black would overreach and play h captures g3. After hg, fg, white had set the little trap, bishop captures g3, knight f5 discovered check, and knight captures g3. Well, black certainly sidestepped that, and he sidestepped it spectacularly by sacrificing his queen. He played queen captures h2 check, forcing white into a double check. A double check is the most devastating type of check because in a double check situation, you can neither interpose or capture the opponent's pieces because there's 2 of them. You can only make one move at a time. After h captures g3 double check, white was forced to retreat, and a typical checkmate on the open long diagonal. And our next example features a unique combination resulting from an advantage in time. White being better mobilized makes one of the most remarkable queen sacrifices of all time. From the situation, it's clear that black's key defending knight on f6 is missing. With this bishop on d3 and the queen on h5, it's pretty obvious that white is looking for an attack against h7. But how to do it? Should he move his knight? In our first subvariation, over here on board 1, if white plays knight captures f6, check, black can simply respond gf6, and his queen protects h7. So, that wouldn't work. Back again to the main variation. Looking again at the situation, how about knight c5 or knight d6? Well, let's have a look at those. If white plays the move knight c5, then all black need do is play g6. And after a move like knight captures g6, h captures g6, queen captures g6 check, black will just come across with his queen, defend the mate. When you capture the bishop with a knight on b7, the knight's going to be trapped on b7. There's no way he's going to get out. And eventually, black will win the game. So that doesn't solve the problem either. So, what's the solution? Well, the solution is queen captures h7 check, forcing black into a devastating double check. After queen captures h7 check, the only response is king captures h7. Now, black will have to go for a king walk. After knight captures f6 check, he can't go back because of the mate with two knights, knight g6 mate. He has to come up. After king h6, knight on e5 to g4 check, the king must continue to walk, h4 check, king f4, g3 check, king f3. White now has two ways of mating. The first is a nice quiet mate. My assistant Dave setting up the quiet mate for me. Thank you, Dave. After castles, black is now faced with a problem. How to defend against knight e5 checkmate or knight h2, one move checkmate. Either way, black will be checkmated. Instead, white chose the more forceful bishop e2 check, forcing king g2, rook h2 check, king g1. Now, in my opinion, white should have castled for checkmate. Instead, he played king d2 and mated with the two rooks. I'd like to use this example to fortify several points. When attacking, attack to provoke a weakness, fix the weakness into a target, capture the target. Here, black has advantages in space and time, but is down 2 in the force count. He's attacking on the queen side, and he must create a weakness in order to have compensation for his 2-pawn deficit. He does this by playing bishop d4, threatening queen takes b2 checkmate. White plays c3, so black has provoked his weakness. Furthermore, he continues rook b8, threatening once again queen takes b2 checkmate. The bishop can't move in order to protect with the queen, because then bishop e3 check. After rook b8, b3. A second weakness has been created. Now, black makes the quiet move, rook d8. He sets white up into a mating net. What would happen now if white captured the bishop? Well, let's see that on our first subvariation. After c takes d4, well, the simple recapture, queen takes d4, and white is helpless to queen a1 checkmate. So white clearly can't take the bishop. Back to the main variation. In our main variation, white plays knight f3. What would happen if white were to try to defend the weakness on b3 with the move king b2? In our second subvariation, we see that after king b2, black has provoked the pawn weakness, fixed it into a target, and now continues to attack the target. After king b2, black plays bishop e6 with the intention of playing bishop captures b3. Play this position with a friend and see if you can figure out the tactical ramifications. Back to the main line. In our main line, after knight f3, black now made a stunning queen sacrifice. He played queen captures b3. Provoked the weakness, fixed it into a target, captured the target. After queen takes b3, a takes b, rook takes b3. Black is now threatening rook b1 checkmate. So white played bishop e1 in order to allow his king the square d2. After bishop e1, bishop e3 check, and now you see the reason for the quiet move. Okay, you've been armed with what to do when you have an advantage or disadvantage in force and space. And you also know what to do when you have an advantage in time, opening up the position and so on. What to do when you have a disadvantage in time? This is much more difficult, for the defender has to be very alert. You have to anticipate the attack and neutralize it before it happens. The way to do that is through exchanges. If you're unable to exchange, one of the most common recourses you have is to sacrifice a pawn, or an exchange is most common. If none of these devices work, try to counterattack in some other way. And finally, you can always use the oldest defense known to man. Run. Prepare your king and make your getaway. Let's go to the studio. In this example, white has more pieces on the king side and is prepared to bring his queen into the action. In addition, he has a target on h6 to work with. He should play the move knight g4, preparing the sacrifice. Instead, he develops his queen to h5. After queen h5, black has to realize he's in very, very serious trouble. And so he has to be prepared to counter what's happening on the king side. He does that by playing f5. This move prepares bishop e8, driving white's queen back. After f5, he captures f6 en passant. Rook captures f6. White now plays knight g4. He's anticipated black's rook retreating, and then he will sacrifice on h6. Instead, black, realizing that he must defend counterattacks, he sacrifices an exchange, beginning with rook takes f4. White now realizes that after g takes f4, bishop e8, he'll have to sacrifice his knight under less favorable circumstances. So he sacrifices it right away. Knight captures h6, check. Black has a choice, either capturing the knight or moving the king. The main move is moving the king. If black captures the knight right away, as we'll see in subvariation 1, then after g captures h6, instead of capturing the rook, white makes a Zwischenzug, queen g6 check. The black king is forced to move to f8 or h8, and after queen captures h6 check and queen captures f4, white will still have an attack and an advantage in force. Thus, the best move is our main line, which is king f8. After king f8, white now plays g captures f4. Black regroups with gain of time, attacking white's queen, bishop e8. Queen g4. Notice how black has forced white to compromise his pawn structure. And after G takes H6, rook captures E6, bishop F6. It's still a very sharp game. It's anybody's game. Black can defend with moves such as bishop F7 or knight or counter with knight D4. It's still a very sharp game. But what was important to notice in all of this is the necessity for taking the bull by the horn, so to speak, and sacrificing when it's necessary to defend. Before we stop tape, I would like to thank National Master Dave Gertler for working with me on this whole production and thank him for his assistance on the set. Thanks a lot, Dave.
Thank you, Yas. It's been a real pleasure working with you and with IVCC.
Thank you.